session. And I'd like to welcome members and also viewers who may be watching the proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the second public session of the newly formed Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. Before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting that your mobile phones are turned off completely or switched onto airplane mode. The purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the all-of-government Climate Action Plan. I'd like to extend on behalf of the committee a warm welcome to Minister for Communications, Climate Action and Environment, Richard Bruton TD, and his officials, Mr Brian Carroll and Mr Owen McLaughlin. And before we commence formal proceedings, I just first want to read out some formalities. I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I will now call on Minister Richard Bruton to make your opening statement.
Well, thanks very much, thanks very much. And first of all, I'd like to start by thanking you, Cathaoirleach, and the committee for the huge amount of work that you've put into developing the concept of a climate action strategy that would help us to achieve the targets that we have set. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank my officials, Brian and Owen, who are here, but also many other officials in other departments who have contributed immensely to the development of this plan, which is determined to raise our ambition and deliver the expectations, I think, that particularly children and the future generations are putting upon us. I believe that the last 10 years has seen Ireland achieve a great deal. In many ways, things that would have been unthinkable in the past, the way we changed our constitution, the way we brought our economy back to full employment. However, we can and must do the same for what is the greatest challenge facing humanity today, and that is the challenge of global warming and the impact that it is having on our society and the sustainability of civilization, of the natural world, and everything, the future that so many people are looking to us to protect. Ireland, as you know, is far off course and very exposed. We set a target for ourselves of reducing emissions by 20%. During the course of the early years of the period 2013 to 2020, the impact of the recession brought us below the curve, but when the economy started to recover again, it is very clear that we failed to break the link between economic prosperity and carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to act now to make ourselves resilient in the face of this really perilous threat that we face as a globe. The longer we delay taking the action that we need to take, the harder it will be, and the fewer opportunities there will be available to our people in that change that is coming forward. Like many of those other achievements, we've started by developing a determined resolve across our community, and I think that's the significance of the Citizens' Assembly first and your own Oireachtas Committee bringing forward, on the basis of the proposals coming from the Citizens' Assembly, a very detailed, worked out strategy based on hours of hearings. I think, like in other of the challenges we faced in making change in this country, I think that has created a very solid foundation. And it's something that can allow us to bring the community together behind this effort. And it's not without significance that your report was endorsed unanimously by the Dáil, and in that process declaring a climate and biodiversity emergency. So I think that has created a very important backdrop for the work that we are now seeking to do. This effort is integral to the vision that we have for Ireland in Project Ireland 2040. That is for a vision of an Ireland that is regionally balanced, that is compact, connected and sustainable. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to realise that vision. I accept fully that government has major and central responsibility in bringing forward this plan and designing the roadmap for achieving our targets. And in doing that, we've sought to design a pathway that is both sensible and fair. Sensible in the sense that we have selected areas which represent the least burden to our community in making the adjustment and have gone to great care to evaluate the different options, the different technologies and how they might evolve over the next 10 years and picking a pathway that represents the least burden and the most opportunity. We've also been at pains to ensure that those who are most exposed or those who are least equipped to support the change necessary will be supported as a part of this plan. I suppose what makes the journey difficult for people is that we do have to all make a big shift in our priorities, and that is our priorities in how we spend our money and how we live our lives. And I think it is really important that we engage with citizens as leaders of this community to persuade them that this is the right course, that the future resilience of their children, of their farms, of their enterprises, of their homes depends on us making changes that adapt to this new reality. There's actions expected of every section of Irish society, and you will see they are detailed in the chapters on electricity, on enterprise, on agriculture, on transport, on the built environment, on waste generation and the circular economy, on the public service, leading by example, and on the international stage. But I think one of the things that I have confidence in is that when we determine to make a shift and we build on the sort of shared determination and we put in place the structures that we're putting in place here that are legally underpinned, that are overseen with the leadership of the Taoiseach's office, I believe we can deliver this change. And I think the committee will recognise in much of the plan their own fingerprints and the work that you've put in. We are supporting the European Union aim to be net zero in 2050 and undertaking the work to show how Ireland can contribute to that. Now, we are aiming for the 70% renewables in electricity. We're aiming to deliver the 30% reduction in the non-ETS, and we're adopting what I might call a precautionary principle in doing that. We're not assuming on high oil prices to do the lifting for us, or switching from the ETS sector to make it less adaptation the undertaken. And the reason we're doing that is, of course, that in the period to 2020, it's the start of the change that we must make if we're to reach net zero in 2050. And the pace of change will increase in that second period after 2030. So it's absolutely right that we try to do as much as we can in this early period when we get much bigger payback in terms of the overall impact. We are adopting carbon budgets with a target range assigned to each department, each sector, and I think this is a really powerful tool of changing the way departments and ministers think about their responsibilities, because we're all used to living within the financial resources that are given to us. We must now be conscious that we have to live within the carbon resources that are afforded to us in a fair way. And again, that's something that your own committee was very determined to see. We've adopted a model of a climate implementation board in the Taoiseach's office so that we have that central not just coordination but I suppose impetus and momentum of accountability to the very heart of government. We are strengthening the Climate Action Committee as you recommended. We're updating our legislative arrangements so that the responsibility and accountability will be very clear-cut. So I hope that you see in this plan something that you can support and adopt. It does deal with, I know, an issue that is contentious for some, namely pricing of carbon. I am an absolute believer in the pricing of carbon. It is important to recognise that the emissions of carbon dioxide damages our environment, and at present people don't pay for the damage that's created. And in any trajectory of change, we have to recognise that the polluter pays principle. The damage has to be included in the price if we're to make the right decisions. I think we have here something that is workable, deliverable. We have 183 actions that get this project off to a very strong start. But I would assure the committee that this will be a rolling plan. We will be taking on board new ideas, new suggestions. We will be adapting it based on experience, and we will be seeking to make this a rolling and adaptive and sensitive approach to what is a really important challenge. I think this is a test for all of us, particularly we who are policy makers, but it's a test for citizens as well. But I believe that the spark of creative power is strong in Ireland, and that if we can kindle that, we will deliver this change and ensure that we do pass on this country, but also this globe, in a better condition for the actions that we are initiating from now on.
Thank you, Minister, and I just want to thank you for coming before our committee at such short notice. In fact, the same week that you launched the All-of-Government Action Plan, because I know members are very eager to discuss the measures in this plan with you. A plan, I think it is the most ambitious plan ever to come from government in relation to climate, and in order to reach our climate, addressing climate change and to reach our targets. I think the fact that you have listened to this, to us as a cross-party committee, many of the recommendations you've adopted, some of them word for word, which I think is quite unusual in any government action plan. And I know that we all look forward to working with you over the coming weeks and months ahead in order to ensure that these measures are rolled out. I think the whole area of governance, the fact that you have adopted our recommendation in relation to governance, is really central to this whole plan, ensuring that we as a standing committee will have the oversight in relation to the implementation and the accountability and the transparency for all government departments and state agencies in relation to reaching their targets. And I would just have a question for you, just in relation to, this is an all-of-government plan, and you have made reference to the fact that in your previous Minister for Jobs and Enterprise, you had an all-of-government action plan in relation to jobs. And just could I ask you, what are the learnings from that process back in 2011, where you had to reduce unemployment from 16%, which is now down to below 5%, but from working with all the different government departments, pulling the different Secretary-Generals, officials together, what are the learnings from that process that you feel you could use in implementing this very ambitious climate action plan?
Well, I think the ones that I said, I think accountability from the centre is crucial. If you have, 15 distinct departments and they all are working to their own priorities and working within their own silos, unless you have not just their verbal commitment to deliver, but also it becomes a priority within that silo, you're not going to achieve the change you need. And when things don't work out as intended, you won't have quick adaptation, you won't have quick responsiveness within the different sections of government. So I think having the central authority of the Taoiseach overseeing those targets, reporting on them on a quarterly basis, does ensure that this becomes a top priority. So that was a feature of the action plan that we had. The other thing that I believe is very important is the capacity to continually adapt to the experience, to new suggestions, to finding where the boot pinches, if you like, in terms of trying to achieve the change. This has to carry people with us. It can't be all about imposing change upon people. We have to talk to people and understand people and work with them to make the changes. In terms of difference, I think the scale of this is different. I mean, one of the things that I suppose was about trying to deliver employment growth was that everyone, I suppose, started from the point of view that they wanted, the objective was shared. I think in the area of something like this, there will be more of a tendency to people to say, well, why isn't someone else making more effort than I am? And I think one of the challenges here is to ensure that what we ask of different segments of our community is fair and balanced. And that represents, I think, a challenge on a scale different from what we experience in the Action Plan for Jobs. But I think, we, recognising the difference, we've put much more legislative infrastructure behind this. We recognise the role of your own committee as being, a really powerful committee. We're recognising the need for individual accountability of ministers to this committee in terms of their areas. So I think I believe we're while building on that model, we're adapting it in the light of your own work and the scale of the challenge that we're meeting here.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Deputy Timmy Dooley.
Thanks very much, for the presentation. I suppose as we dig deeper into the report, it becomes fairly evident that whilst the report is clear on why we need to do what has to be done, and I think we're all aware of that, it sets out clearly what needs to be done in terms of reaching the targets that we have set for ourselves and moving towards that net zero emissions by 2050. What it's relatively light on is how we're going to do that. And in saying that, we need to look at the costs. So I know there was a discussion about this at the Budgetary Oversight Committee yesterday, but have you any clarity on the costs on the one hand and the savings based on the actions that are there in terms of what needs to be done? Like, could the government set out, how much of the costs of the new climate plan are going to have to be carried by the Exchequer on the one hand and non-Exchequer sources on the other? On the accountability and targets, the Department provide information, or could the Department provide information about implementing the committee's recommendations? We need some more information there. Just on the just transition, like if you go into that in detail, our recommendation was clear that we needed a just transition task force. Now the plan only identifies that a just transition review will be carried out by NESCO. We're already doing some research in this area. Now, if we're serious about the impacts that are coming from the actions that have to be taken, it is going to impact very significantly in certain parts of the country. We had a lot of talk here about the impact on the Midlands as a result of the non-use of peat anymore in any aspect of our economy, not just in the electricity side of things, in electricity generation. There is a target there to end the burning of coal in Moneypoint by 2025. The plan talks about moving away from fossil fuels in heating homes. That impacts on people who are already servicing that industry. So there is going to be very significant transition required in the various different sectors. And I don't know how that's going to be catered for from a government perspective. And maybe then, the more I read into the report, it gives me an understanding as to why the Taoiseach talks about nudging the public along, rather than hand-holding them through this process, which I firmly believe is necessary. Because if you nudge people in these areas in terms of how their jobs are impacted or gone away, you're going to leave them behind. And the one thing we were very clear at this committee, right through the various different hearings, was that we wouldn't end up with a Rust Belt situation like happened in the United States or has happened in other countries where they've moved away from some of the traditional industries. So I would like to hear much more from you, Minister, in terms of how that process is going to be managed, because that we can have all the accountability that we want, and we can have all the oversight from the Taoiseach's office, but unless that we have the work contained within, then that's just going to be a box-ticking exercise. Government will have to take a much more involved role. On the energy side, very much support the idea of getting much more of our energy from offshore wind. Again, I'd like to see, detailed plans in place to assist in supporting the development of that sector, and recognising how, there can be a dividend from being part of the early adoption of those technologies, and being part of developing it to a point where it can act as a new industry for us, if we're to benefit from the dividend that may be from changing technologies. Also on the energy side, you might explain to us why it's going to take 2 years to introduce this tariff for solar PV, which is talked about. It says it won't be in place. A pilot micro-generation grant scheme for solar PV won't be in place till 2021. That seems quite a distance out. Also, if you might confirm that community-led development and citizen participation will be supported in the first round of the auction under the RES scheme, because I think we really need to get moving on that. Very much part of this is getting citizens to participate. And these are measures where people can participate, want to participate, they contact all of us. Microgeneration is a big issue. On the housing side, have you done any studies, or have you available to you any information around the cost per home or the cost per house in various different sectors? We all know, largely based on years that houses were created, what the building systems and models were of the time. So have you done any analysis of what the costs will be per house, or a typical cost to do this deep retrofit? We all use these terms now, they flip off our tongue, but somebody's going to have to pay for it. And I'm certainly concerned that if we're depending on the citizens to make these changes so that we meet our binding targets, then we're putting a huge burden on the shoulders of homeowners. And I think we need to be upfront with them at an early stage and indicate what the costs are there, and will they be able to afford it on their own bat, or will we have to do more as a state to support them? Our report requested that the Department of Agriculture produce a plan for the agriculture sector to align it with meeting our Paris Agreement commitments, including a review of current national land use and agriculture scheme and extensive public engagement. Your plan makes no such commitment, nor does it provide any of the detail on the ongoing review and revision of Foodwise 2025. So you might just mention some reasoning there. I think that's about it for the moment, Minister.
Thanks very much indeed, and just to thank the Deputy for his constructive contribution throughout this debate, as I know we've both in the chamber and here. In terms of costs, I mean, in the National Development Plan we have 30 billion assigned to this, and they include, as you know, investments in retrofitting in the grid and so on, including the Climate Action Fund. So there's very significant money being set aside to achieve this. But what we do also need to do is, and one of the things we've learned, we have to be more innovative in the use of some of those monies. So, for example, and it goes to your final question, at the moment we rely largely on subsidies to individuals to undertake retrofitting. We simply do not believe that on the scale and the aggregation that we need to achieve, that will be a model that will deliver. And we need to think in terms of targeting areas on a wider basis, aggregating and scaling up work, looking at smarter procurement to get both the professional advice and the installation done more cost effectively, developing smarter finance, easier pay methods, and so on. So we recognise that we need to use our money more innovatively. There is close to 4 billion set aside in that area. We need to ensure that we use that in a way that can make more impact and that can be targeted and deliver more quickly than what the present model will do. Similarly, I suppose you know, in delivering this, we've had to, in every sector, consider ranges of policy instruments. We're not going to be able to look to the Exchequer to fund all the change. So what we've had to do is look at in what cases our regulatory change is appropriate. So you create an obligation for people to make those changes. Those tend to be adopted in cases where the case for not making the change is very weak, and that we need to make those changes because it's a standout economic and climate sensible change to make. And that's why we are talking about, in respect of, for example, that employers with more than 20 parking spaces should be required to have electric charging facilities, or the building of new homes should be required to be net zero, or to drop the use of oil boilers from 2022. So in some cases we are making decisions to, if you like, impose where the cost has to be borne by the people. But we are going to choose those areas, and they will evolve with time, choose those on a sensitive basis, recognising the difficulties that have to be encountered, the supply chain issues and so on. There's also, of course, in some areas, it's really important that carbon pricing be recognised as a way in which it changes the payback period for people contemplating changes. If you have a trajectory for carbon price, you will adopt changes on your own personal choice basis earlier than otherwise. And I think everyone who has come to this challenge and who's advising, like the Climate Advisory Committee, have recognised the role of that. But there is, of course, the role of incentives too, and that often is important, particularly in introducing people to technologies that they mightn't otherwise consider. And we've had significant supports, as you know, for deep retrofitting, for the adoption of electric vehicles and so on. So there is a mixture of policy tools that will have to be developed and adapted over time that shapes the share out of cost. Of course, equally, where you raise money through a carbon price, you have revenue to dispose of. And as you know, the Minister is working at the moment, is consulting at the moment on how that could best be done, and there's an opportunity for people. The other thing I should say is that in selecting the measures, we have chosen, and it's interesting that about 75% of the measures pay for themselves. So they're good for the country, even if there was no climate crisis. And I think that's important to recognise as well. So there isn't, if you like, a net cost to all of these. Some of these are very justifiable, particularly in areas like electric vehicles, some of the retrofit work that is to be done, some of the agricultural work to be done, and so on. So there is the selection of measures and their sequencing is based on recognising that some are economic today. Technologies are anticipated to, for example, bring down the price of batteries at a certain point and will become economic. So this is an evolving area where we have to adapt policy and make sure that it is delivering the targets. So, there isn't perfect foresight that you can see a curve with a whole lot of very fixed elements in it and put an exact share out of the sort that you're suggesting. I believe that just transition should be integral to the implementation of the plan, and I think the balance of having the NASC making very strong advice, but it be core to the implementation of the plan that is run from both the Taoiseach's office and my own. I think that is the right way to do it. It makes it integral to it. I think we will have to use creatively, as we've already indicated, some of the new opportunities to make sure they're located in places like retrofitting, microgeneration and so on, that they are recognising areas where there is pressure, the bioeconomy, the renewable sector, as you indicate yourself, and so on. We will need to use the regional enterprise funds, the urban and rural funds, the climate action funds, in a way to support that transition. Selecting the 70%, I think that is really important. And you're right, we will need detailed planning for that, and that planning is being undertaken. At the moment, we can absorb up to 65% renewables on our grid. We are now creating the plans to push that up to 75% and from there up to 90% to make the changes in the grid's capacity to onboard much higher shares. We also have to make changes, and again, the committee has been very conscious of this, like the Foreshore Act, to make it adaptable to onboard the offshore wind capability. So you're absolutely right, there will need to be detailed planning in place, and that is underway. There will be that plan will extend to dividends for the community, and we anticipate both community gain, community participation, and we will have a pot in the first res that will be allocated to community bids. The housing, we do have a lot of, the SEAI have done a lot of work on both how much it costs and how you incentivise people and how you can group people to come together to do work together. They have their sustainable energy communities, they have their grants. Some of them, as you know, are up to 100% grants under the warmer homes. And they do set out there, you'll have seen them yourself, 14,000 for a typical home to do external wall insulation, but if you're doing it by way of cavity wall, it's only about 2,000. So there are very significant differences in the cost of improving the fabric of your home depending on the starting point. The heating control systems, they again are running around €1,000, but they have a very rapid payback in terms of how they impact on your bill. Heat pumps, there's figures out there, and solar, and there are grants to match. So I think we have a fair idea of the costs, but different homes will have different menu to pick from as to what they have to do. And we have to, the ambition is that by the end of this, 500 out of the 1.75 million, so about 30% of homes by 2030 would have made a very significant investment in the fabric of their houses. And I acknowledge that this does mean people having to change what they regard as the priority for their home, that people have to think that future-proofing their home for the sort of changes that are happening in our globe is as important as other things that people do spend on when they're looking at their home. As I say earlier, we will have to change our approach as a state to help make that happen. The model that we have now, I don't think is fit for purpose. On the issue of
on the current grant system that we have,
I think we need to move to an aggregated system, moving on a much more larger scale, looking at scaling up work together, doing collective work, giving people the option in a particular area to do that work, but also developing the smarter finance, the easier pay methods to back it up. So we need to design a suite that will be effective, and people can have different ranges of support within that, depending on how well equipped they are to pay.
Do you have kind of a timing in your mind on that?
Well, we're starting immediately to set up the group, cross-departmental group, to design that, and that is one of the priorities that we have, because I think it is integral to moving from where we are on a more accelerated basis. On agriculture and land use, clearly, I'm sure the Climate Advisory Council indicated they are doing work on agriculture and land use, and we do look forward to that. It will be integral to the design of the CAP, which is also in evolution within the Department of Agriculture. But there is no doubt that land use and the way we manage land can make a huge difference. Even in this iteration to 2030, land use, agriculture and forestry is contributing more than 40% to the amount of abatement, including if you like, the legacy of the forestry we have there already. So it is really important that we make decisions here, and there will be big changes in farm practices, as well as diversification over time, an ambition to nearly double the amount of forestry that we're planting. So delivering in those areas will be integral to the plan.
To move on to Deputy Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank you, Minister, and your officials for coming in this afternoon, and to welcome the publication of the Climate Action Plan. It's a very ambitious plan, and it is going to prove to be a tremendous challenge, but I think the fact that we're approaching it in the way that we are in terms of the whole of government approach and reaching out into the communities, I think will be a very important means of engaging with everybody. I think there's no doubt that I think the citizens now are very aware of what we need to do, and the fact that we're an island, a small island, small landmass, that we really need, I think, to show this kind of leadership, and I very much welcome it. I just have a couple of questions following on, Minister, from your contributions so far. I just wondered, in relation to the smart finance, if there are details on that as yet as to how people can access that. That's the first thing. The other one I have is in relation to the sustainable energy communities and the microgeneration, which I think is really very positive. It's something that came up a lot when we were thinking about our recommendations for the plan. And for example, if there are rooftop solar panels, you know, how will the planning restrictions be handled in relation to that? Will they be changed? Whatever. So that's, I think, something that's going to be really very important. What about, I noticed that you're talking about a Midlands retrofit scheme, and I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit more detail on that. As somebody who's a member of the transition team in Offaly, which is a cross-stakeholder group led by Offaly County Council. There's a lot of learning, I think, that they can bring to the table on that. So I think it'll be something that would be very useful to engage with them, as well as maybe you might be able to give me some information on that. The other thing I had is in relation to governance, and I think it's very important that the board be based in the Taoiseach's office. And I was just wondering how practically is that going to work, or who will form part of that board? What else have I now? Just the Just Transition Review Group. I'm just wondering about how that's going to work as well. Will that be maybe engaging with, for example, the transition team in Offaly, or how will that go within NESC?
First of all, I absolutely agree with you that reaching out to communities is crucial, and someone said to me, why did we put it in as the last chapter instead of the first? And I suppose that's a reasonably well-made point, but I suppose it was to outline the scale of the challenges in the sectors, and then see how do we ensure that communities can participate. Sorry, and I omitted to answer Timmy Dooley's question on microgeneration. You're absolutely right. We do need to look at planning restrictions. That is one of the areas. We need to look at the pricing, and as you know, the Citizens' Assembly recommended, and indeed there's an EU obligation that we would pay a price. The Citizens' Assembly recommended a wholesale price. We are conscious that we need to think that through, because some of the schemes elsewhere have run into difficulties of equity as between people who are selling it to the grid and people who aren't, and the share out of the cost of running the grid. I think we have to make sure that there is an equitable scheme there. We aim to have that worked out by the end of 2020, which is ahead of the legal obligation, which is 2021, to answer Deputy Dooley's point. So we hope to have that work completed in the course of next year. The sustainable energy communities, I think, are really great exemplars, and they have run from small scale to very large scale. They have, and to be fair, I think the SEAI have very good experience in this. They have mentors. They then have the opportunity to develop a plan, and their support for the development of the plan, and then they then have the opportunity to implement that plan, and there's another layer of support for that, and the sums of money can get quite big, and they require partnerships across, so it can't be just the local authority, it has to be multiple sectors within the community. The plan envisages that the number of those would grow sixfold over the course of the plan. So we want to see far more people getting involved in that, as well as the sort of community participation that Deputy Dooley was talking about. In terms of the smart finance details, they have yet to be worked out, or how the area-based schemes will work, but there's no doubt that the local authorities and the housing associations are critical players. Obligated entities, as they're called, who do now support some of the sustainable energy communities, employers, funders, and of course the state and the SEAI. We will have to design a package that can aggregate that work, can take on the professional expertise in an effective way, can reach out to communities in a way that's more effective than the one-off application form model, develop easier pay methods, look at how could smart finance, and we have seen, like micro lending, we have seen the ability of the state in partnership with financial institutions to bring down that cost. It may involve the state taking a layer of the risk, but we need to evolve that model, and as I said to Deputy Dooley, we're starting the work on that as a priority. The full makeup of the implementation board is yet to be decided, but essentially it is to make sure that you have the Secretary of State to the Secretary General to the government, as well as the Secretary General to my own department, is at the core of it, and that the reporting is to the Taoiseach, because I think from our experience that does create a level of accountability that guarantees a much higher response rate to the actions that we are putting in place. So I think that was the issues. Did I miss one?
Was there the Midlands? Was there one?
Yes, the Midlands.
Well, the Midlands. I mean, we need that area-based scheme is evolving, and that's so it would involve obviously local authorities, housing associations active in the area. We would look at other entities who are energy entities in the area, funders, employers, community. We need to get a group that is effective, but also a model that can deliver effectively, and that's the design of that is underway. And there's a recognition across government that we do need to do that. That proceeding on the present basis with subsidies won't get the scale of change that we need.
Okay.
I'm going to bring in Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Thank you, Richard. Minister, I absolutely agree with you. I think we're at a turning point where this country is going to become a leader on climate change. I think we have that creative capability, as you said. It works best when we work in collaboration. We do have political consensus, I understand, on why we need to do this, what we need to do. I suppose what we have to work out is the how, and that is an iterative process. And I think there's really important work in this plan, which echoes the work we did in our committee around that process and in the way we pulled together to do it. So I absolutely agree. That's the good news, and that's the kind of key story. I have a couple of questions when you get into the detail, if I can, on some of it. If I can just refer, we got a handy graph just on the in our pack today, which brings it to the core. And I suppose the committee work this has been doing is always on the understanding that, we have this 100 million tonne gap. And if I'm understanding it rightly in the pie chart that is set out there, the better land use management is, as said, that's historic, mainly forestry investment, and also all those Chagas recommendations around manure, soil management, the technical stuff accounts for that. The Project Ireland 2040 is the national development.
The Chagas stuff is in this.
Is in, okay, fine. So that's mainly forestry then, and historic forestry. The Project Ireland 2040 is the existing National Development Plan kind of measures, if they're all delivered. And then, so this new pie, this 58 million tonnes, they effectively are the additional new measures that are contained in the plan. Is that correct? Or that's
correct, yeah.
Yeah. On the overall target we have, you're in page 27 of the Climate Action Plan. You make the case that what we're looking to achieve is a 2% reduction per annum in the next decade, effectively, and then to meet an 80% emissions reduction target by 2050, we'd go up to 7%, as I'm reading in the box there. If we, and I'd be interested to hear what exactly is our commitment to a net zero emissions by 2050? Is that contingent on the European Union as a whole agreeing it? Or are we agreeing it now, or what's the status of that? And if that is the case, if we are agreeing it, that 7% per annum increase, or decrease rather, in emissions after 2030 would I presume increase, it would have to be higher again, 8 or 9%. Just one question to put you. Everything I've read in terms of this transition, we have to do it, is that it's cheaper to do it sooner rather than later. Deferring is much more expensive, and you risk all sorts of stranded investments and wrong investments in that path. How would you answer the criticism that 2% per annum isn't ambitious enough, given that that's leaving us with an 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, whatever it is, percentage decrease in subsequent decades, which is an incredible challenge when you get to that level of annual reductions? Are we committing to 2050, and how do you justify 2% now, putting off the larger gains till later?
First of all, yes, we are supporting the EU move to achieve a 2050 reduction, but we need to evaluate what that will mean for Ireland and whether we can also commit at a national level to a similar reduction. That work will be done over the course of the remainder of the year. But we are joining, if you like, the coalition to see this ambition set. In terms of the point you make, I suppose what we have to do is look at the technology that we can be reasonably sure about, and we don't have that level of foresight to be able to envisage those changes. The sort of things that will help in that later journey are not all economic at this point, whether it be carbon capture, carbon reduction, alternatives to using fossil for backup in our electricity grid and so on. So what we have done is we've started with the 2030, which is a legal obligation, where we're way off course. It's not as if we're on course for it. We're way off course. I think the latest figures from the EU would suggest we would be running about close to 20% off course. So we would be not delivering anything close to. So what we've sought to do is to get ourselves on course for the 2030, but consistent with the net zero in 2050. So where there is, if you like, standout indication that we should be adopting a technology early based on reasonable knowledge of its direction, we are including it in the early phase, but where that is yet to be there, we're not bringing forward those. And I suppose while it is cheaper the sooner you act, the better, that's not true of every action you could take. There are plenty of very, very expensive actions. If you sought to do them now before the technology has evolved, they would prove very expensive. So I think what you have to do is judiciously choose the pathway based on the information we have available to us, and we got help us do that, to identify the direction of travel of the technologies. And that's why you see a bigger emphasis in this on electric vehicles, where there is very strong confidence that technology will quite quickly bring a tipping point for the adoption of electric vehicles. But there is an imperfect knowledge of the future that you have to weigh against, acting in an early basis.
Okay, if I can then, just 2 points I can share on two sectoral areas where I think we should be making much more, not just relying on technology tweaks that a Mach curve approach tends to bring you, but actually thinking about system change, and that has to come from the top down, has to come from the centre. One of the key recommendations, in my view, in our work on the Joint Oireachtas Committee here, was the recommendation of a land use plan, akin to what they've done in the UK, and Lord Devine was very clear on this and the benefits from that. And I suppose I was specifically looking for that, and while there's a lot of references within the agricultural section to kind of some of the issues we're talking about, it's not specific and clear. The question I have is Action 110 on page 54 of the Action Annex of Actions says that we will develop a roadmap by the end of the year to ensure the future development of agriculture and land use, including forestry sector, will be built on environmental sustainability and contribute fairly to Ireland's climate, air and energy targets. In my mind, that roadmap, in a sense, could and should be a land use plan. In this sense, not down to telling what every acre is going to be, but we're saying we want to increase forestation from 5,500 hectares per annum to 8,000, but we say nothing really in terms of how many of those hectares will be new continuous cover forestry, how many are going to be just the continuation of single species, clear felling, fast rotation forestry, because I think it's vital to get that sort of detail, because we declared a biodiversity emergency, not just a climate emergency. And I always remember our advisor here, Peter Thorne, eminent scientist, saying we have to look for win-win solutions. And land use is the biggest area of potential win-win solutions, where in the rewetting our bogs, in the diversification of farming, in the changing of the complete farming model away from the current one of just beef and dairy production at all costs, environmental costs, that we stitch in this opportunity. Now, I think that has to be mapped. That has to be a land use plan based. Can that Action 110, where you say other key stakeholders will be involved? I think the key stakeholders should involve the environment, include the environmental community, the likes of the National Wildlife Trust and others who have a real interest in that, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance for us to tackle the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis. That can only really work effectively, in my mind, when you have a proper land use plan top-down. So is my interpretation of what that roadmap is that a land use plan effectively that we're going to devise?
Well, as I understand it, there is a number of pieces of work going on the concept of agricultural evolution and land use developing. Part of it is that from the Climate Advisory Committee themselves, where John Fitzgerald is undertaking work in this area. The department is also committing to engage with all stakeholders, not just the farming stakeholders, to evolve what they describe as a roadmap. They also have to evolve the common agricultural policy, and as I've seen from the comments of the Commissioner, there is a very strong appetite within that, and indeed it's written into the new Common Agricultural Policy that 40% of the money must be assigned to work that improves the environment and improves carbon emissions. So I see that body of work incorporating the sort of ambitions that Deputy Ryan is talking about, but whether it meets what you describe as a land use plan, I can't say that this is exactly what you have in mind, but I think the ingredients are the same, and the ambition is very clear that we need to see the evolution of our agriculture in a way that future-proofs family farm income, because if family farm income doesn't recognise that this world is changing, that the expectations of consumers are changing, that we as a farming country exporting 90% of our output, we have to be conscious of what those who are buying our product expect in terms of certification of the environmental standards being applied. And I know a little bit about that from being on trade missions and being responsible for presenting the case of Irish produce. That's I envisage. It is very close to what the Deputy is saying, so I think it does meet his... The very
last point, if I can, Chair, and this is my real criticism, I have others, but this is the central one. The transport section in this plan is woeful in my mind, Minister. It shows complete lack of ambition for change or for real efficiency and long-term decarbonisation. We're sticking effectively with our current transport plans. We're just turning from petrol and diesel cars into electric vehicles. And while I'm very much supportive of electric vehicles, that's not enough. That's not a sufficient change. Firstly, rather than just saying we're going to have 860,000 electric cars, we should be saying let's do car sharing. Let's really make that happen. And we may achieve the same emissions reductions, the same transport service, by only buying half those cars, or a third of those cars, or a quarter of those cars, which may be much more achievable. And similarly, the absolute lack of any other vision for a switch away from our current roads-based transport system, which is leading to further sprawl. It is fundamentally unsustainable, impossible for us, in my mind, to meet our 2050 net zero targets if we continue with what the Department of Transport is overseeing, which is a massive continuation of long-distance commuting and sprawl, huge use of resources in ever-increasing building out and out, and a roads-based system that can never be climate ready, even if you're all-electric vehicles fleet. We will have the gridlock we're facing, the social costs in it, and the environmental costs in just the consumption on this individual car-based system. That has to change. And I suppose if you said at the start, which I absolutely accept and welcome, that's an iterative process, I would have to say the first thing that has to go is the transport section, and you're going to have to come back, the government, or a government's going to have to come back with something completely different, because this does not deliver. In my mind, and I've set out to the Transport Committee some of the reasons why, it completely fails to address the scale of the challenge. What was the level of cooperation from the Department of Finance or Transport? How come they didn't come back? I mean, the only thing they've come back with effectively is a daft scrappage scheme that we've no details on, a congestion card hint that doesn't mean anything. It's just to switch electric vehicles. I mean, after 2 or 3 years being at the crosshairs of everyone's attention has been the one department which is completely failing to address this issue. How come they come back with nothing else? How come they're failing so clearly in their responsibilities?
Well, I think the first thing you have to say that for an awful lot of the travel that generates, the transport that generates carbon impact, public transport doesn't represent an effective substitute for it, and that is a part of the problems we face. So when we looked at and got the professional advice as to how much would modal shift contribute, unfortunately the contribution of modal shift to reducing carbon emissions was surprisingly low. I was surprised myself. So we do have to focus very much on changing the type of travel that's occurring and moving to electric vehicles, and they do represent a very strong opportunity for us to meet our carbon emissions within an early period. I don't accept your view that modal shift is not a big part of the change that's coming along. It may not have a big impact on carbon emissions, but it has a huge impact on the quality of life, particularly in our towns and cities. And the new strategies that are going to emerge on park and ride, the new strategies on cycling, the new capability of local authorities to introduce measures in their own areas to improve the modal split and the environmental soundness of what's happening in transport in their towns. I think that is a very welcome change, and we look forward to those 5-year strategies that are going to have to be published before the end of the year or early next year in respect of cycling, park and ride and so on. I think the Department of Transport will also make the point that if you compare new public transport, which from memory was about 8 billion, versus new roads, which is much smaller, about 3 or 4 billion in the plan, that comparison is not far off the 2 to 1. But I don't think 2 to 1 is the way we should be planning infrastructural choices of this nature. And I think one of the important decisions in this plan is that anyone planning any public investment is going to have to price carbon on the basis of a trajectory reaching €265 per tonne by 2050, and that will change the type of investments that are chosen within the National Development Plan, undoubtedly. But there is needs for roads, and I think other deputies around would indicate there are needs for critical points where new road investment is needed. So I think there is transport will continue to have to make significant changes. For the first time in this plan, we have a very ambitious target for transport to reduce its emissions. You'll have seen over recent years that transport has consistently expanded its emissions, not only right throughout the whole period nearly, even before the recovery started, there was sign of transport emissions going up. So this is a massive change that the Department of Transport has committed to in the direction of travel of the carbon emissions that it is generating. And there is huge commitments to both improving public transport, but also changing the nature and the fuel uses within it, and developing strategies that help make travel more aligned to compact living, which we all desire to see. And I think we see, for example, in Bus Connects, the ambition that's there, not only to improve the bus service, but to have 200 kilometres of cycling, safe, separated cycling. There is significant ambition here that's a shift with where we've been before. So I would commend the Department of Transport. They have stepped up to the plate and are taking responsibility here. And clearly, we will, like every other sector, expect them to deliver on what they're seeking to achieve here.
Lee Smith.
Thank you. Thanks for your attendance, Minister. And the first thing I'd like to start with, as I usually do when we talk about this issue, is the words of the IPCC report, which, just to repeat them, I think it's worth couching everything that we do at this committee in that context, that we need far-reaching, unprecedented and radical change. Now, when I look at this report at first, and when the fanfare dies down, you have to really look over the layers of green clothing that are around what really masks a business opportunity for industry, for corporations and particularly for private finance. But I do want to ask you some particular questions, and my first question is on the talk in your report about phasing out our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, I'm obviously going to ask you, are you going to continue to block the bill that calls for the ending of issuing of exploration licences? But also, can you please explain to me how, if we're going to phase out our reliance on fossil fuels, that we can continue to support the development of more runways in airports? Indeed, the report doesn't look at the aviation industry at all, and there's no measure of what the aviation industry's contribution to our emissions is. We're supporting new runways and we're supporting the development of LNG terminals. So I think that's one fundamental contradiction in the overall aims of this report. There's another one that really jumped out at me, and that was that there's no attempt here to put the burden of dealing with this crisis onto the global corporations, be it the fossil fuel industry or the food corporations, who make billions in profit. All of the attempt is to put it back on changing individual behaviour, and that includes individuals who are as well off as you, Minister, or as poor as the travellers whom I met this morning dealing with issues to do with fuel poverty and energy poverty in their Halton sites. But here you commit to attracting data centres into Ireland, and it is estimated that 30% of our energy needs, our energy production, will go to keeping those data centres open. But the solution to that is to urge and plan for what is called corporate power purchasing agreements. And they are described as long-term contracts under which a business agrees to purchase electricity directly from an energy generator. So from where did this idea come that we'd be littered with data centres that would use up 30% of our overall energy production, that use up probably most of our water, and that then would be powered privately by energy companies dotted around the country? That idea did not come from the Citizens' Assembly. It didn't come from our joint Oireachtas committee. I'm just wondering, did it come from somebody you know, like a former head of DPAR or some secretary in the Department of Finance? Because it strikes me as a business plan writ large that would actually do more to damage our reduction in our emissions. I want to agree with Deputy Ryan on the woeful attempt to deal with public transport. In fact, no attempt to deal with it. I heard the chairperson on TV3 last night explain that by saying that it's all contained in the Capital Development Plan, but it is not, because that plan only commits itself to bus connects, which literally only puts a couple of hundred more buses on the roads in Dublin, for example, than were taken off the road during the austerity years. So there's nothing there to help us deal with what is required in a massive increase in frequent, we would argue free, but certainly much cheaper public transport to be accessible in every town, in every village, not just Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Limerick, etc. Because unless we do that, people will rely on their cars. They have no choice. And I heard during the election campaign, Saoirse McHugh, who became overnight a very popular figure because she was so radical and so passionate about climate change. She was a candidate in the West for the European Union for the Green Party, and she described her life. She said, I live on Achill Island. There's one bus out in the morning, there's one bus back in the evening. The house is 200 years old. How am I going to cut down on my carbon emissions if I don't have proper public transport and a help to retrofit the house? You're going to have to continue burning coal to heat the home and load her car full of diesel. And that is where the bulk of Irish society is at. They cannot afford, Minister, despite all the commitment to private financial loans being available left, right and centre to people. The vast majority of people in this country, Middle Ireland as it's often described, cannot afford to take out loans of 40, 50, 60,000 euro to retrofit their homes. Middle Ireland cannot afford to borrow to buy an EV car in the morning and start paying back the loans. Most people struggle to pay their mortgage, their rent and to get to work in over-expensive private transport because public transport is not available to them. To me, this is an absolute disaster of a plan, and I just want to quote back to you a part of your plan which I think sums up the attitude of your department. Those inflicting the damage do not pay the cost of the damage they inflict. This is the rationale for charging a carbon price for carbon emissions, which reflects the growing damage that they are inflicting. This serves to discourage emissions and make carbon abatement more profitable. As it happens, I agree with that statement. If it applied to the fossil fuel corporations and to the global corporations who abuse this planet, either through the overproduction of plastic, the overproduction of goods, the overproduction of oil and the overproduction of gas, and then force us all into situations that we use these products, I would agree with you. But that's not who it is referencing. That is referencing the ordinary people in this country whom you say must change their behaviour and give them no help to do so whatsoever except to tell them to go to the private financial market. The IFSC will gloriously come up with innovative ways to deal with this. They were great, weren't they, when they came up with innovative ways to help companies evade tax and to create Ireland as a tax haven. I think this is really a very damaging document when you look at the lack of attempt to really deal with the problem. And, you know, other colleagues here have spoken about the EVs, but I don't understand how in 10 years you're going to get almost 1 million EVs into this country. The production of them and the importation of them somewhere on the planet, maybe not here, is going to create a massive amount of carbon. What we do need instead is a massive amount of public transport that is frequent and free. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the question of retrofitting homes, because in my clinic on Monday I had 3 families come to me who, and I've written to you about it and I have the letters back from you, who in one case are earning over €5 a week more than what would qualify them to be determined as living in fuel poverty, according to the Department of Social Protection. They are not entitled to fuel allowance because of €5 extra a week. In another case, €7 extra a week. In another case, €7.50 extra a week. And yet they are families who live pinned to their collar to try and heat their homes, must turn on the gas, must burn the coal, must burn the peat briquettes, because they have no other choice. And in most of those cases, they also have varying ill health issues to do with arthritis or lung disease of one sort or another, but they don't qualify. And there is nothing in your document that deals with them. There is nothing in your document that deals with the travelling community who launched a report on poverty among travellers, fuel poverty among travellers this morning. I was the only deputy who attended that. They invited 4 different ministers and all of them were unable to attend. A disgraceful abuse of a community we just celebrated in this House a couple of years ago. I want to suggest to you, Minister, that the best thing we could do is that instead of passing a motion that declares a climate emergency, that you pass legislation, like you passed FEMPI legislation, financial emergency measures in the public interest, during the crisis, during the financial crisis. Let's pass climate emergency measures in the public interest that will allow us borrow massively at a very cheap return to this country, allow us to invest, the public invest in renewables, not put it out for tendering to the private market to see what company might be able to build offshore energy or onshore energy. Private tendering again Have we not learned from broadband, or indeed from the Children's Hospital, that if you want something done in this state, the state must take it by the short and curlies and do it itself? This document does nothing about that. It throws the responsibility entirely back at the market which is responsible for putting the globe into the danger that it's in already. And the specific questions I would like you to answer, I'll just go over them again because I've gone on a bit, is from where the idea came that data centres would somehow be a great solution to whatever, reducing emissions or help our society, our economy, from where this idea of corporate purchase power agreements of electricity came. Could you also tell me how in 10 years you're going to deal with the question of nearly 1 million electric vehicles being purchased in this country when vast majority of people can't afford to do it? And will you make some comment on the lack of any mention in this document about aviation emissions and the support that you're giving to the increase in the number of runways that are going to be introduced?
I suppose the difficulty I have with Deputy Smith is not her commitment, but every new problem she applies the same old ideology, and it simply won't resolve. Simply won't resolve the challenges we face here. It is, you say with one voice that there's no help to do anything except go to financial institutions, and then you make a pitch for an adjustment of the means test on a scheme that is providing 100% assistance to people in fuel poverty to do exactly what you're asking to be done. So, clearly there is state hope, state support out here to help people. There are 32,000 homes every year who are undertaking retrofitting, and all of that is receiving support from the state. There are people making changes to electric vehicles and to hybrid vehicles, and that has gone up sixfold in the past so far this year. There are people making that change, and the state is supporting them. There is a grant of 5,000 off your VRT, 5,000 subsidy. There is a free or a subsidised electric vehicle charger, and many people are making that decision. It's a choice that they're making. As technology comes down and the price of these changes reduce, more people will make that change. And the state is going to design a scheme to make it easier for people to take on the retrofitting challenge. So we are devising ways of doing this that will help people to make the change. That is the right thing to do in this situation. And I think there's many people who recognise that, and we've taken advice from the Climate Advisory Council, who is established there to help us do this, and we are taking up much of the advice, and indeed the advice of this committee here itself. In terms of, and that is how electric vehicles will be taken up. We purchase each year 280,000 vehicles each year. So our aim is that 960,000 of those by 2030 would be electric vehicles. That is achievable. I believe the technology will make that possible, and people will have a better, not only a better environment, but will also have cheaper cost, because the cost of running a petrol car is 8 times that of running an electric vehicle. So there is savings here to be made. People will be making decisions that are in their long-term interest. On the issue of data centres, the evolution of data centres isn't an invention of this document. The reality is that we have data centres being established on a regular basis here, and what we're saying, we need a strategy to manage the demand that is coming from data centres, which is part of the evolution of the digital technology society, if you like. We need to manage that in a way that it does not put excessive strain on the targets we're trying to achieve. So this is about better regional allocation of such investments, but also, as you say, seeing that those companies would seek to make their own arrangements for securing sustainable renewable energy to serve their needs, and that the needs of those multinational companies wouldn't all fall back on the state, as you rightly say. They should carry some of their responsibility. In terms of the The airline industry is part of the emissions trading system, not the sector where we have a legal obligation to make changes within Ireland. So the airline industry is part of a global European emissions trading system, and they too, and we will be supporting changes in that emissions trading system to demand more contribution from those airlines in making the change. I think those were the points that you wanted me to respond to.
Senator Devine.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Minister. I guess following the good work done with this committee and the expert telling us that we should have pride in Europe as leading the way in climate action or being world leaders, but unfortunately our competition is very, very poor. If we're the leaders and I suppose the fines that we're going to come up with, the rest of the world is in a sad, sorry state. But hopefully with this action, and it needs to be immediate and robust, we'll correct our rankings and keeping the world a safer place. I just wanted to pick up on a few issues, and basically I know people have touched on transport, and in particular the implications on health, on public health. Minister, have you considered the potential degradation of the air quality in city suburban rings as an impact of the expanding park and ride facilities that are lauded as a way to ease congestion and get people onto public transport that often doesn't have the capacity to bring them in? But the studies, and especially there in the congestion charges and the levels of the nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide increase in the suburbs where commuters were converging to park their cars in London and other cities throughout the UK, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that. The other question on transport was to do with the Shannon Foynes waterways. Now that was committed to some years ago, but there's nothing in the report that may add to a waterway conclusion for sustainable transport policy, and is there plans or feasibility assessment of the use of the Shannon Foynes waterways for waterborne barge freight in the terms of reference for sustainable transport review? On transport as well, I mean, I've been involved, and I suppose a lot of my Dublin colleagues would be involved in the Bus Connects, and time again it's a $2 billion investment, and it's going to take 7 or 8 years if it were to be agreed, which is nowhere near being agreed at the moment, but it would take 7 to 8 years. So, but still the plan is to buy the fleet, and the fleet is still diesel. And I just think we've just got to change the record, draw a line under that. And I've asked the NTA time and time again, but they're sticking to a diesel fleet. So by 2028, if it were to go ahead tomorrow, 2028, this city would still be run on diesel fleet bus transport, and we need to change that, because it's ultimately quite a high level profile of what the seriousness we take of transport and the cleanness of the economy and the greenness of our air. The other issues would be, I suppose, just a fair transition. You talked about that just before, but the ILO, they've laid out a framework and the steps needed, and it's been included in our Sinn Féin's minority report, and it gives a template to what is needed for a fair transition that's understood by workers, understood by people in communities, and not just, I suppose, in the Portlaoise area, but throughout the country, and that we need to change. For example, with these unaffordable EVs that we were all to buy and purchase, that's one argument for the EVs against the affordability aspect. But who's going to mind them when they break down? Who's going to fix them? Who has the skills to be the car? It won't be a mechanic any longer, it'll be a car electronic person, so it's in the area of electronics. So is that included in our apprenticeships? Are we specifically training workers and people to do that? The same as boilers. Boilers no longer will be defunct in so many years' time with this plan. Have we people then to to look after our heat pumps, speciality sort of, or just a different, it's that just fair transition that we need. If we can get back the workers, that the young people in particular of the 300,000 that left this island and took their skills with them, if we can get them back to actually provide the skilled workers and to train for in a just transition. The cost of retrofit was touched on as well. For 60,000 average, for the bigger home, 60,000, to borrow that, yet you wouldn't see a return for 33 years. It doesn't give an incentive. So I don't know what we can do about that, but actually to address it, because the dividend would take 33 years to get to. So what can we do to do different there? And very simple things like roof and attic insulation is cheap. It's really effective. Every building could be given that standard and be brought up to that standard without too much massive outlay to scare off householders that wouldn't have the 60,000 or the 40,000, and then move to the next level of insulation to reduce emissions as well. That's it. I think, Minister, if you could answer those, I'd be most grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you're right. The development of a park riding strategy will have to look at air quality and the location and the management of. There will be other issues there, management of traffic and so on. But there's no doubt that park and ride can contribute, as Deputy Ryan said. Also, sharing can contribute, and it is perhaps an even lower cost way of delivering change. And I think all of these alternatives need to be developed, and this plan is open to sensible suggestions as to how those can emerge. I'll have to confess I don't know whether the Shannon Foynes is part of a plan. I suppose we didn't get down to that level of individual project. The bus fleet from the 1st of July, there'll be no diesel-only buses purchased, so that's just from the end of this month. I know there are complaints about Bus Connect, but I think the central strategy of what it's trying to do, to have a more integrated transport system, albeit requiring people to make changes, at certain points on their journey. I think I believe it is attempting to integrate.
Just a point of order, just about the buses. The buses will continue to be diesel because they've been already pre-ordered, and that needs to stop.
There are some buses that were ordered last year that are being delivered this year, but from the 1st of July, no new diesel buses will be ordered. And any of the buses that are being bought at the moment are replacing buses that have a far worse carbon and indeed air quality impact. And I think as we move towards electric vehicles, one of the advantages, apart from the carbon, will be the reduction of the air quality pollution that goes with fossil fuel burning vehicles. On the transition to new sectors, you're absolutely right. We do need to develop the apprenticeships and the traineeships. And I think, to be fair, we've been through a much bigger transition in terms of the sectoral makeup, where we saw the collapse of a construction sector virtually from, I think it was 12% of employment, and it collapsed to nearly 0, 1 or 2%, and it blew away a lot of apprenticeships and traditional opportunities. And we've managed to see those people retrained and absorbed into other sectors. We have a much more robust mix of sectors, but we have to do the same now in terms of moving from some of the more traditional, that were very fossil dependent sectors, to new sectors. And I think we have absolutely the capacity, with a just transition strategy, to make those changes and support people to make the changes. And we will be well able to meet the needs of people adopting refitting of their homes. These are skills that are learnable. They are largely blue collar skills, and you will see a tendency of some of the new technologies to displace blue-collar workers. So there's an opportunity that can be a very positive one for identifying opportunities in the microgeneration, in the retrofitting, in the bioeconomy and so on that have a skill mix that can be very positive for people who need to redeploy into new areas. So that's central to it, and we do have to see the ETBs and the Institutes of Technology step up to the plate in this area, or those that are newly transitioning to technological universities. And I think, as an aside, we need to see those taking on far more people in their more mature ages than gearing up their system only for younger people coming out of the schools. You're right that some retrofitting can be very expensive and some can be very cheap. And I think you're right also in advising that we start with the shallow retrofit. And I think by adopting an area-based approach, we can do that on a scale and make it easier for people to take on. If all they want to do is the shallower retrofit, that can be possible. But of course, we will need to be seeing people moving to deeper retrofits over time. And the figures are there on the SEAI website if you're interested in. As I say, it's less than 2,000 to do a cavity wall, and it gives you a very strong improvement in your fabric. But if you have to do an external wall, that's 14 grand, much more expensive to achieve the same thing. So clearly, there's a rationale for us to try and start with the cavity walls and move on to the deeper ones as we evolve a system. And I think you're right to suggest that we should do the sensible things first that yield a result. So I think we shouldn't seek to scare off people by bigging up the most expensive possible retrofit that could happen to a very large house in a very isolated area with very bad heating systems and so on. For a lot of people, the changes will be more modest and more affordable and have quicker payback. But we do need over time to be accommodating those deeper changes, the move to heat pumps, the move to heat controls, the move to deeper retrofits. But we can do this once we start this journey with a credible model, which we need to design, I think we can ramp it up.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Deputy Brian Stanley.
Thanks, Seán Sherlock, and just to welcome the Minister and his officials here on the plan. Obviously, some parts of the plan we see it falling short. The fact that there are sectoral targets and that there are sectoral commitments and the governance structure, and we would have looked for all of that, that's welcome, that's happening, that there's straight lines of accountability and measurements, and that obviously gives us something to work on. And just on that note, just I suppose to, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by an absolute minimum of 80% by 2050. And the clock obviously sticking on that. And with this plan, we should have a minimum of 20% done by within the next 18 months, which obviously we're not going to do that. But by 2030, we're looking at a 20% reduction. And the problem with that is that leaves us a 60% reduction within the following 30 years. Now, there's such a thing as the swinging 60s, and people refer back to decades when there was major changes or whatever else, or major upheavals. I think the 70s were supposed to be socialist, but and unfortunately they weren't. But we're in a situation here that if we go through we have a big transition to do in the 20s that's coming now, okay. But even allowing for that we make those, we have that brown to green revolution in the 20s, that in the following 30 years there's a huge catch up to be done, and you might just address that, because we have huge concerns about that. And the reason I say I welcome the sectoral targets and the governance commitments and that is that it does, for the first time, give us a straight line in terms of accountability, in terms of oversight. And I pointed this out. If you go back to the debates around the Climate Action Bill, Low Carbon Climate Action Bill, back here 5 years ago, you will see where I pointed out this consistently over and over again, that was a fatal weakness in that legislation. So just that issue first, and just go through the other issues I have quickly. In relation to the just transition, there's a couple of things I want to say. Obviously, I see Portlaoise here, and that's good. But that obviously should just be, a test case in terms of a trial for what can be rolled out in other towns. And I would just say it should go past the 2 prisons. It should go past the 2 hospitals. You know, there's communities around that as well that need to be brought into it. And the Midlands, the support for the regional transition team. But I want to say something on that. We have to get away from putting, you know, task forces in place when the event is happening or has happened. And we argued, Minister, from the beginning that we need actually a just transition commission. That we actually, because there's a whole range of things going to happen. You know, motor mechanics who are skilled up and who are out of their apprenticeships, you know, their skills are going to be out of date. The apprentices coming in this year are going to be okay because they will have most of them will have the required skills. They'll have to be dealt with. There's money pine. You know, there's several other places where there's going to be transition made. And just to address that, in relation to the retrofits, and I want to deal with this in terms of retrofits and just transition, even though they're in 2 separate parts of the document. In the Midlands, it's obviously going to affect an awful lot of workers, and in other parts of the country. But on the other hand, we have this huge need to do a lot of expensive work in terms of retrofitting. And there's the question of financing that. And a lot of households, you know, who don't have the earning capacity, or who have earning capacity, but it's soaked up with childcare costs, with commuting costs, and paying existing mortgages from now till thy kingdom come, will not be able to access that 50 or 60,000 finance to actually do it. And we need to deal with that. The other problem we have, and it's a challenge, these are big challenges for us. The other big challenge we have is in relation to skills and labour. You know, we still have, I think, about 160,000 people unemployed. Now, if we bring in, and this is not, I don't want this to be taken up the wrong way, I deal with a lot of people who are foreign workers who have come here and they're doing fine and they're working here and that's all good and they've brought skills and energy. But if we don't have houses to keep housing people, we're caught in a kind of a perfect storm with housing. We were caught in a perfect financial storm 10 years ago. We're now caught in a perfect housing storm in that we don't have the skilled workers to build them, we don't have the skilled workers to retrofit. If we bring in more workers, we don't have the place to house them. We're caught in a bind with this. And what I want to make a suggestion to you, that to try and deal with part of this, because there's probably a number of parts to the solution, that what we look at is that there's a section of that 150 or 160,000 that we need to make a decision as a government, as an Oireachtas, that we now decide that we're going to train up and upskill a section of that workforce. And we have SOLAS, as you said, we have ETBs, which have been modernised and I think they're working better than the old VECs. We do have training, we do have major training centres, including in the Midlands, and we need to move ahead with this now to start skilling up those workers, to fill those vacancies and to carry out this work, to carry out this huge retrofitting that's going to be needed right across the state. And I would just urge that we would look at that. I think if we wait for, we have big semi-states there, we have semi-states that are diversifying. Bordnamona, I know they're going to do herbs, I know they're going to do green energy. It's not going to replace the jobs. I started in Bordnamona one morning and there was 95 other people started the same morning as me. That was in just one place, right? That's not going to happen now in terms of the types of industry they're changing to. And I'm not arguing against the changes they're making. They have to make the changes they're making. But Bordnamona has a huge history of apprenticeships. Some of my family got trained up in apprenticeships in Bordnamona. There's an area that we need to be looking at. A company with the history, with the infrastructure to do this. And just the other 2 issues I want to touch on briefly is in relation to biogas. Just on page 41 of the document which we got today, you deal with this. And I just want to say this as it is. If you look down along the actions, carry out a public consultation, develop an updated feasibility study, set a target, right, that's fine. Assess potential impacts, consider something else, examine potential of something else. It's a bit fluffy, right, in that it doesn't doesn't do the business, I think. And I would just make this appeal to you. There's a microgeneration bill that I brought in over a year ago, that I published a year and a half ago now. It's actually a 2017 bill that I published on microgeneration. It's before the committee here, and I'm asking you not to hold that up with a money message or any other last-minute booby trap, that we let that bill go through, and we are wide open to amendment that. And I put that forward, and our party put forward deliberately to kick-start the debate, but also to try and get a bit of legislation in place, because there wasn't legislation there. And we're wide open to working with people on the right, left, centre, green, anywhere, that will, to try and get that legislation moving through. And you might just respond to me on that. And just on the biogas, issue, that as well. I was at the Budget Oversight Committee here yesterday, because we're dealing with these issues, and I raised issues with the panel there, including Professor John Fitzgerald. Sorry, just one thing on the retrofitting. I forgot to say to you that because of the demand for housing, every 9 houses that we retrofit, it means 1 house less built with the current workforce that we have. That's what the RSI says. So if we retrofit 9 houses, that's another house that's not going to be built. So the question on that, and just with the biogas, I'm just urging as well with the biogas, and they dealt with it, I raised this issue with them yesterday, that they believe that up to 20% of electricity can be produced by biogas because of the large agricultural sector we have. And I just think it needs to, and I'm saying this constructively, Minister, I think it needs to loom larger in terms of our plans in how to meet dispatchable power, because the wind won't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and it doesn't particularly do that sometimes when we need most electricity on very cold nights and that. So we do need to be developing renewable gas, and I think we need to be putting that more centre stage.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to thank the acknowledgement of the benefit, some of the good things in the report. I think you're asking the same point that Eamon Ryan asked earlier on, and that is, are we leaving too much for the 2030 to 2050? And I think I would give the same answer, that we don't have the same certainty around the costs and the choices of technologies that we need to make those decisions now. And we could make bad calls by picking wrong technologies and sinking a lot of resources into technologies that don't evolve. So what we've had to do is take the best advice on the evolving technologies and pick the ones that show that we can deliver by 2030 with the least burdens being imposed on Irish people, and that's what we've done. The next phase will need more work, and I think I've talked to John Fitzgerald, I'm sure he said it to you himself, that we need more research to be done on that next phase. We will start to do that work ourselves, but there probably needs quite a bit of work to identify the sort of technologies that should be adopted over that 20-year period from 2030 in order to achieve the net zero. The issue of just transition, I would say that one of the things that I was very gratified by was that the regional enterprise strategy that I was party to putting in place, having regional enterprise strategies in every sector, that when the difficulties came for Bord na Móna, the Midlands Regional Strategy immediately moved to adopt decarbonisation as a central plank of its strategy, and it is using the Regional Enterprise Fund and its own the own network that it has developed to deliver that. And that was, I found that heartening, that something that was decided in tougher times when we were talking about just trying to get jobs off the ground is also in place to deal with adaptation which is occurring. I'd also make the point, just a general point, that we have come from an economy in the space of 10 years, lost 120,000 jobs in construction and created well nigh 500,000 jobs in other sectors. That was a phenomenal transition, and I've seen the stories of people who lost their job, took on Springboard, took on a traineeship, reinvented themselves and are back in that economy. We need to make that an easier thing for people to do, and I share your belief that the ETBs are really well placed to do that, and we will be relying on them to respond to the change so that as retrofitting starts to take off, they are responding with the skill base. I would argue with my former employer, the ESRI, that simply saying one house and one retrofit. I know from a lot of colleagues that I talk to that there isn't a housing boom or there isn't a lot of house construction going on in a lot of counties and a lot of constituencies, and that there is capacity for people to do retrofitting in some of our areas that aren't experiencing that sort of acute demand for housing and acute house building, and it doesn't have the displacement effect that you're saying. But I do acknowledge that there is a capacity, and we need to plan for it, and we are committed to do that. Again, I don't think you should be saying that everyone is going to have to face a bill of 50 to 60,000. If you have a cavity wall, you can do that for £2,000. If you don't have your attic insulated, you can do that for 1,000. You can put in heating controls. There's a lot of things you can do that aren't those huge asks. Yes, we have to start to do deeper retrofits, but we want to get a third of the houses by 2030, and we want to get on a roadway where people are doing more and more of this sort of thing. But for a lot of homes, it will be possible, and we will support them to do shallower things on a journey over time to deliver that. So, I don't think we should be trying to put people off by saying, you've suddenly to face this huge bill. We can evolve that and develop the system. On biogas, I suppose it does go back to the point you at the start. The reason why we're more reticent and saying we need to assess this is that on the cost basis, it doesn't look like it's in the area of the curve where we need to move immediately. It is further up that curve, and until we test and assess its capacity, we need to do more work to see what role biogas will have. There are many people who say that biogas, burning it in a power station, is not a good policy. We are supporting it in combined heat and power situations where you're getting a much better bang out of your biogas buck. So I think there is, it's right to be a little bit more cautious about some of the technologies, and that's my understanding of the situation that biogas is in, that there's more work to be done to prove its contribution and the timing at which it should come in.
Just on a point of order.
Deputy, but he did with biogas, and he mentioned biomass as well, but he dealt...
Just one question.
Very briefly, though, you're way over time.
No, the Minister said briefly, just in relation to that, workers being available, and you're correct that in some counties there isn't a lot of house building happening, but the workers in those counties, in a lot of cases, they're working in construction in the cities. And what I'm trying to get across to you is that if you just take the Midlands, for example, there's a high enough unemployment rate, but what there isn't a ready availability of construction workers, and I can tell you that builders can't get them. Okay. And I'm pointing that out to you because we need to upskill those workers.
But you'll read there is a commitment there that the ETBs will take a very active role in developing these skill bottlenecks and try to develop those, and they're already doing it. And there is a big appetite, and I'd say to employers who are having difficulty, come forward and take up the apprenticeships, because when I was in that department and we were trying to we were evolving new apprentices and old apprenticeships, and we weren't getting enough employers coming forward to support them. So employers need to recognise that they have a responsibility to share in taking on apprentices and making those possibilities for young people. There is an appetite and a desire to deliver apprenticeships.
Senator Michelle Mulherin.
If you don't mind, I have to leave.
Yeah. Okay.
But can I make a suggestion for the next day, because we're quite a large group, that there would be some sort of speaking rota or some sort of time cap.
Because we reverted to an ordinary committee, we moved away, but we might agree that, okay.
Even through party leaders at the Hunt, right, system.
Okay. Because I suppose this is following the all-of-government plan, I wanted to give members a chance of this. Yeah.
2 hours.
You're after Senator Mulherin. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge this as being the most substantial and comprehensive environmental and climate action document that this country and this government, any government has ever produced in this country and that we have ever seen. And that there's a lot of joined-up thinking in it because of so much, I suppose, comprehensive consideration given by this committee in producing its report, Citizens' Assembly, and the work done by yourself, Minister, and all the departments with whom you also worked. And so this is absolutely massive. And notwithstanding all of this, it's true to say that it's an absolutely massive challenge to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is take carbon out of our economy, carbon out of our lifestyles, and also as a consequence to give ourselves cleaner air, cleaner water, all the other good things that can flow from this. And I suppose we only have to look at the likes of Canada. We see Trudeau's green agenda. We look at the Gilets jaunes in France, and we see a rollback on carbon tax. That this can even be more divisive than climate change itself, and that's not taking one bit from the changes in climate that are resulting in catastrophes around the world. But this is very divisive, and the very people that will be telling you you should do something about climate change won't help one bit. They won't have any solutions, and they'll just be full of criticism. And while we can understand that the ordinary person can be fearful about so many changes and the cost, there's no solutions being provided by the detractors. That's the truth. And that's where the dialogue has to be at. And I think we have to keep going back to the fact that dialogue is about just transition. How do we make it fair? How do we balance it? If we agree something needs to be done, and it would seem that there is a general consensus that it is no longer about pointing the finger at agriculture, at some other sector or somebody else, but it is tough and it's difficult. And I suppose, Minister, let me see, there's a couple of things. First of all, this comes back to dialogue with the public, and I think on a previous report, going back a couple of years, that NESC prepared, and they were looking at delivery of renewable electricity. And one of the most significant issues that's identified wasn't cost, it was actually community acceptance. And I think it all goes back to that. It's about where people are at with this in their individual communities, how it impacts on their lifestyle. And in order to facilitate that dialogue, I know that there's work being done by Minister Donoghue's department around carbon tax and how it might look, and we're trying to find innovative ways to engage with the public. But at the moment, pursuant to our national planning framework, we have the regional assemblies being charged with delivery of regional economic and spatial strategies. And it seems at the heart of this, because we are talking about fundamentally overhauling lifestyles which are based on fossil fuels, which are based on technology which emanated from fossil fuels, and basically also the internal combustion engine, where we've gone down a road where we haven't been investing in renewables, which means that renewables now are more expensive to deliver than conventional in the area of electricity. And I'm just wondering that in the context of this ongoing process under the National Planning Framework, where you're going out into the regions and you're developing spatial plans, can we bring an element that's quite specifically around climate change so that people can be encouraged to engage, and then bring it down to the development plan level in the local authority areas, and join up with the regional climate change offices that you have established in the regions, that we have that joined up thinking as well, whereby we do get to see whether it's, where are we going to have the charging points, what do we need to do, where are we going to put the infrastructure, that bigger picture thinking is going to happen. So that's, I suppose, the first question for you. The second question is, now that you have this all-of-government climate action plan produced, are you going to be amending the draft National Climate and Energy Plan that you submitted to the European Union Commission back in December, and which is now in draft format? And I understand that the Commission is to revert to us with its views. And I'm just wondering, in what way might you be changing it? Because obviously you've come up with this document now. There's been a lot of consideration. There's been a lot more focus on climate change than there ever has been before. And I'd just like to see how one fits into the other. Just again going back to the whole issue of communities, and there is a lot of talk about microgeneration, and this is really important and very significant that people feel they have a stake. But I think the other reality that will have to be acknowledged is most communities don't have money to be developing renewable energy projects. So we have to find other ways that people get benefits. And I know that your department, Minister, has a code of practice, for example, for wind farm development. And these projects are being developed at the moment. But unfortunately, Minister, the community benefit that's envisaged is a lump sum per, say, megawatt installed to the benefit of the community. And it gives no recognition in this to the fact that some people are living beside wind farms, some people are living beside this infrastructure. So there needs to be another layer to this of benefit to a household. Because I have an issue in relation to, in the area I'm living, Oireachtas wind farm, which the community are accepting, Bordnamona ESB joint venture. But the households living immediately beside it will no get, it's a sparse rural area, they'll get no particular gain. They're looking for reduced price electricity. It's a near neighbour principle or scheme that's run by ESB, but there's no government guidance on it. The local authority don't seem to be able to deal with it. So you have individuals. Sorry, Minister, my only point is that we have to recognise that some people are going to be asked to take more of a burden than others. And there has to be more than a community gain where 15 kilometres up the road you're going to give money to a community centre that most of these people are never going to use. So I'd ask you, Minister, and I'll bring further details to you. I've already put it to the chairperson here that we'd look at this issue in more depth at this committee, but I wanted to flag it with you, and that there is a deficit in the Code of Practice for wind farm development as it stands at the moment. I suppose I just have a couple of more points. Yeah, I'll write. Yes, yeah, I will. I just want to respond to transport because I want to commend the objective that we're going to try and decarbonise transport. And while I want to also commend a lot of contributions here from the city folk among us about public transport, and I can well see if I lived in Dublin or Galway, there needs to be public transport. But when the commentary, they sort of extrapolate out and we're getting into talking about rural areas, it sort of sounds like a parallel universe. You know, we need roads to put the buses on, these buses, and we're not going to have a bus running every 10 minutes like you do in a city. So the idea that, you know, rubbishing the idea of electric vehicles and this isn't enough, and rural transport, we need roads, and we also need roads to make sure that all the development, economic growth and social growth doesn't end up in the cities, because there are whole regions, west and northwest, which did not get roads built during the Celtic Tiger, and they are acknowledged as being at a disadvantage because they didn't. Okay. So this goes into unreality, no more than some of the talk around agriculture, and this idea of not spending money on roads is crazy, because, as I say, you're not going to be putting a train to every village and up every bohreen in rural Ireland, and it's grand, we'll tick a box. There's no comparison with something running every 10 minutes. And just finally, two final points. The best thing for rural Ireland is the National Broadband Plan, meaning people don't have to get into their cars. So I think the sooner we can roll that out, the better. And I would hope that, there's a lot of talk here about, the market and commercial investment and intervention. That's all been tried here. Support the National Broadband Plan. It's not something that's commercially attractive, and that's why government is having to spend the money on it. And there's been so much warped commentary on the National Broadband Plan when it's exactly what's needed in rural Ireland for connectivity, and not just for economic growth, but also medical interventions in the future, remote diagnosis, all this sort of thing. The Minister, SEI Warmer Homes funding, as you've rightly pointed out, the most disadvantaged people in our society who qualify for fuel allowance get their homes retrofitted 100% free of charge. So this is very welcome. I wanted to ask you, Minister, about a current issue which I have flagged with you, which has not gone away. Very briefly, which is
going into issues.
Well, it's to do with the Warmer Homes programme and how we're going to fund these things. There are at the moment, Minister, contractors who are rolling out, and there are plenty of people willing to do it. I don't know what the deficit is, maybe there is a deficit, but I know of contractors, private sector contractors, who are doing this work, and not only is work in the future being put on hold, but they're not being paid for the work they have done, and they're waiting months and months and months, and there's a problem in SEAI, and I'd like a clarification, Minister, about when these contractors are going to be paid, when are the people who are looking for their houses to be retrofitted and fixed. When is that going to be done? And just finally to say, Minister, I welcome in relation to agriculture the approach taken, and that we're going to seek to implement objectives in the Teagasc report, which gives a roadmap in this sector. Agriculture is big in our country because we didn't have heavy industry, as we know, and that's why it's accounting for so much emissions. But I have to say one thing, Minister. Myself and a number from the Agriculture Committee had occasion to meet with delegations from China, Russia and other countries outside the European Union. And I can tell you this, Minister, they haven't a bit of interest in carbon emissions reduction. Not a bit, Minister, because we wanted to compare experiences and challenges to farmers. I know they don't have common agricultural policies and that, but I would like to think, Minister, that further strides would be made in recognising the efforts to date by our farmers, dairy, beef and across the board, in reducing carbon emissions per unit in their particular sectors, and that our farmers will be championed for having more carbon efficient production, because food isn't an option, an optional extra. We need to eat, and we want to get it from the most carbon efficient way, and that will be championed for our farmers, because I can see it as a big challenge coming up when we're competing and we're crucifying our farmers, when other countries who are these bigger markets that we're selling into really don't care.
Okay, I'm going to go to the Minister now.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome both the support of Senator Michelle Mulherin, but also her passion and insight into the issue, because this is not an easy issue, and she rightly hones in on community acceptance. I suppose there's a number of things that we're seeking to do here to try and build that up. One is that every single public body, whether it be the local authority, the HSE, are all being asked to adopt a climate change mandate, so that, I hope that in every community you will have public leaders adopting a strategy in their own interaction with their clients and their suppliers and their own workers, an attitude that this is a change we need to make. And I know that her own local authority is taking a leadership role in trying to do this, and have their own ambition to have a carbon neutral strategy. And I think her suggestion is good, of using the regional spatial strategies to embrace the physical change, because it just put me in mind, if I came along 100 years ago and said I was going to put in every village a tank underground containing fuel that is highly inflammable, and expect people to come along and dip into it to pour into their cars, I think there would be a huge reaction against it. But now it's part of the furniture. Everyone walks in. There's the garage in every forecourt in every town and village, and people don't bat an eyelid. There is a question of, this is a change. We're not used to the technology, the infrastructures that we now need to be sustainable. We are used to those infrastructures that make us unsustainable, and there is a real issue, as the Senator says, is how do we socialise that structural change in our society. And all I can say is you were trying with the community gain, with the community participation, which would include local people who are close to facilities that are being provided, sustainable energy communities, having mandates for every public body. I see it myself with the green schools, that a lot of kids are coming home and lecturing their parents on the weaknesses of some of their behaviour. So I think we are starting to wheel that scrum, but there's a lot more to be done. Yes, we will be amending the NECP, the National Energy and Climate Plan, and it will, for example, the new target we're adopting for renewables. I think in the last NECP we were putting our hands up for, of that gap that was to be met of 75 million tonnes, we were meeting 16 million tonnes from what we were doing, and there was another 58 to be found. We will be showing how we hope to find that 58 million tonnes across different areas of activity. I fully agree with you that balanced regional development constitutes a real sustained challenge, and the National Broadband Plan, the reason why we made that decision wasn't to bring all that ire down on our head about the cost of this. It was because we believed that $2.5 billion spread over the next 25 years is a correct investment to future-proof rural Ireland, and I will defend that to the last. I think it's the right thing to do. I think we'll be proven to be right, whatever about the short-term, pushback that there is, and it's right that everything be cross-examined and due diligence be applied. But I think at the end of it, I think we are making the right decisions. On the SEAI scheme, like every other scheme, a budget was allocated, and they have to stay within budget. And there's no doubt that one of the features of 100% grants is that demand grows exponentially when you have a 100% grant. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do need to move to area-based schemes where we could do big blocks of work together, and some will be 100% grant people, others will be at different levels and different contributions, and I think it will be a better model when we develop that alternative.
But Minister, is the budget spent? The simple point is that these are private contractors, they have employees, they're doing as we ask them to do, and they're not being paid. They have cash flow problems which are going to impact on their ability to continue on in their business. We're over time with that.
Major point, Senator. I really am.
I want the answer. Is the budget, and I find out is the budget spent, because these people are trying to plan for their business.
There's a profile for every scheme. There's a profile, and where, if you like, demand runs ahead, there has to be some constraints to manage within the available money, and that's the reality.
Including not paying people for work done.
Well, I don't. If you want to send me details of that, I can assess those. On the agriculture, I mean, I think at one level, the UN recognises that in seeking climate abatement, we have to do so without jeopardising food production. On the other side, I think it's absolutely in the interest of Irish family farms that farmers continue to drive on the change to reduce the carbon impact of what they're doing, and look at all the options that they can adopt to do that, because I think long term that's securing the family farm income in a better way. If we make the changes early, in farming as in other areas, we will be more fortified for the changes that are coming in the future as well. So I think you're right. The Teagasc map gives people a very practical menu of things they can start to do. I think that we need to see more people adopt those and verifiably show that they've been done.
Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Chairman. I have 7 questions. Can I ask a question and get an answer, or do you want to ask the whole lot
Maybe
together?
ask 1 or 2 together, maybe in threes. I'll just go for that number. Group them a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, Minister, first question, just the plan that you've published says there will be a Climate Act amendment bill to be published in early 2020. Can you commit to having the heads of that bill published before the end of 2019 so that we can start the review process on it? Next one, the plan does not incorporate many of the recommendations of the Joint Committee, especially in relation to rural transport, and for which there is only a vague reference to a plan to be developed with no timeline or targeted emission reductions. Will the Minister, can you explain just why he did not adopt the Joint Committee recommendation in relation to rural transport strategy, developing the local link service and shared mobility? And then just the agricultural measures and the business are business as usual, basically, and assume that the Teagasc plan report will be delivered. Most of these measures are cost neutral or represent savings to farmers, and yet they haven't been implemented to date. Can you explain why you'd be confident that these technological and efficiency measures are suddenly going to be so effective as to deliver emission reductions of up to 2 million tonnes by 2030? Do you want me to keep going there?
I think on the bill, I think we've set the first quarter of next year is when we want to be in a position to deliver that bill. It is certainly something we will be working to be as effective as possible to deliver that. The recommendations of the committee, we have sought to be to reflect the recommendations of the committee. There is a commitment in the area of rural transport, but of course this is only a starting point, and we will evolve this strategy over time. And this isn't the end; this is the start. The Teagasc changes. I think one of the changes will be the Common Agricultural Policy has made it very clear that on the next occasion, 40% of the money will be linked to identifiable environmental and climate improvements that are adopted by the sector. So there will be clearly a connection, an incentive connection between making changes and drawing down CAP supports. So I think that is one of the reasons why we can expect change. But also, like in every other sector, I think farmers are under the very same, understand, probably more than most, the need to change. That if we want to pass on our planet in a better condition to our children and the next generations, we have to manage it well now. And farmers are closer to understanding that, and they see the relevance and the reason for the changes that we are asking them to make. So, like every other part of the community, part of this is, as we talked about earlier, is people recognising and buying in to this being a high priority for our communities. And I think farmers are probably in a better place to understand than most.
Unfortunately, all the recommendations from Teagasc have been there for ages, and farmers haven't bought into them because they haven't been paid to buy into them. And so, I mean, as what you're saying is that you're waiting for the new common agricultural policy to pay farmers to buy into these. I think there's measures. A mix, like in every sector, there will be a mix of incentive. There will be new standards being evolved over time. There will be, that's the direction that we're moving in every sector. So, in order to future-proof the farming sector, just like every other sector, we start to need to see new standards becoming common practice. At the moment, we may just have pioneers, as you rightly say. There are a lot of pioneers out there doing great things. We need to see that those pioneers mainstreamed, more people following in their tracks. We need farm leaders to be at the forefront of advocating for that. We need those who are buying products from farmers pushing that need, because their capacity to sell produce, particularly on international markets, is very closely connected to their ability to show that they're certifiable good environmental practices. So I think there is a convergence of, it's not just about money, there's a convergence of what the market needs, what consumers need, what the expectation of the community around them, what their leaders, what their pioneer leadership is seeking to do. And it's the same in every other sector. We're going to have to combine all of those, because we can't pay, the taxpayer can't pay for everything that has to be done. So, in every sector, that's the same. So, if we could just go back for the Climate Act, you said that it's the first quarter of 2020 that's going to be dealt with. But when will actually the heads of bill be published?
I haven't got that. I mean, obviously, we've only, this is only off the, we've only come off the printing press on Monday, having got government agreement to these initiatives. Okay. So we now need to move and implement.
Just the next question is the agricultural chapter doesn't treat forestry with any sense of realism, I believe. Forestry targets are not being met, and the forestation plans are based on monocultures of sycamore spruce and lodgepole pine. So shifting the planting policy to native species in line with the committee report would represent more carbon storage and a boost for biodiversity and wildlife. Yet biodiversity and wildlife get no mention or measures in the report, and the forestry recommendations are all existing proposals with nothing new that I can see anyway. So will you commit to shifting forestry towards a sustainable, diverse and native planting, including measures to promote agroforestry with copses and farmlands and hedgerows?
It is my understanding that that's the direction of travel, but I think, you know, I'm not the Minister for Forestry just because, you know, we have a commitment to double the planting. So, and there is a move, as I understand it, to see much more mixed planting. And there is a recognition that there will need to be new policy instruments evolved, and there will be stakeholder engagement to see what those might involve. And I know the Department of Agriculture are looking at what that might imply. But you know, I haven't. You know, if you want that level of detail about specific, you know, choice of planting, I'm afraid I'll have to ask the Minister of State to give you a response. I don't have that here.
There's 3 left.
Yeah.
So, Minister, you've spoken very supportively about the 70% renewable energy target that's proposed. That I would propose that for the Joint Committee report. But now it turns out that 15% of this will be met with corporate power purchase agreements, and so that they won't be funded through RES, and they won't be obliged to provide any community engagement or benefit gain measures either. So, will you ensure that the guidelines and through your department or through the Department of Housing and Planning, so that all planning permissions for further onshore wind farms are issued with conditions that community engagement and benefit must be adhered to? And
the last question. Yeah. Do you want to give the last question?
Well, two left.
Just. Yeah.
So, just in relation to the EU Commission response to the report, they are. I think they say they're very weak in terms of the community response to the. The closure of the power stations in the Midlands and stuff like that there. So, yes. So I'm just wondering what your view is in relation to that, and like, you know, the Joint Committee report recommendation was for a very specific strategy for those regions, whereas you're proposing to give the topic over to NESC, which can only give advice rather than establishing a multi-stakeholder body that will be empowered to make decisions and access state resources. So I'm just wondering what your view is on the Commission's response in relation to your report. And the last question just is in relation to the report. Our committee report was strong on its call for nature-based solutions for climate action, which will help in our effort to address the climate and biodiversity emergency that was declared by the Dáil on May the 9th. Specifically, our report recommended that the development of the National Hedgerow Conservation Strategy to ensure the conservation of these important features in the Irish landscape, which are so valuable to birds, pollinators and mammals. There is no coherent approach to protect hedgerows in Ireland, and inappropriate management, including cutting during the period when it was illegal to do so, and destructive removal of hedgerows is the #1 complaint from Birdwatch Ireland received annually from members of the public. So there is no mention of this recommendation in the National Hedgerow Conservation Strategy in the Climate Plan 2019. Why not, and can it be inserted now at this stage?
They're all the questions, are the Deputy?
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, though, for listing the questions.
Well, I mean, this is a plan to address our climate challenge. There is separate work going on biodiversity. Now, there are elements here where you know, the Department of the Heritage, Josepha Madigan's department has made significant contributions here, where it is directly connected to you know, improving the carbon sequestration of wetlands or so on. But this, I suppose, this document doesn't purport to be everything that needs to be done in the environment. So we don't deal with biodiversity, nor is it everything that needs to be done in energy. So we haven't dealt with energy security, for example. So there, like, what we're trying to do is a particular to meet particular challenges. It isn't, you know, it isn't substituting for the line responsibility that continues for a lot of elements of environmental improvement or, you know, risk abatement that that continues. I believe the NESC, as I said earlier, the NESC, with their experience and their social partnership makeup, is very well placed, given the sort of work they've done in the past, to advise the implementation board. But it will, of course, be through the implementation board, with the Taoiseach and my own department represented there, who will devise the actual annual strategies and actions that emerge from that thinking. So it is at the heart of it. Just transition is at the heart of this, and will be a responsibility of that core implementation board. I think the response to the closure in the Midlands, I think, has been strong. I think Bord na Móna have demonstrated that a state company has been pioneering in identifying new opportunities as it moves away from being virtually entirely a fossil fuel company to develop renewables, develop resource and material management, and develop alternatives. And so that's exemplary. As I said earlier, the Midlands Regional Enterprise Strategy, which I established myself a number of years ago, it has been there to take up the challenge of developing an effective strategy for to move the Midlands into opportunities in the decarbonisation sector. So that structure which we put in place is there and is taking up that challenge. It's number one of its priorities.
What would your view be then, so on the Commission's, the Commission's negativity around the strategy? What would your view be on that?
Which Commission?
The European Commission. They've said that the fair and just transition could be done better.
That's their comment on the National Energy and Climate Plan that was submitted last December. That's not their comment on the fair and just on the document we only published on Monday. They haven't had a response to that. On the issue of community engagement by those who develop wind farms that aren't proposing to sell under the RES, I presume that there will be new guidelines for the development of planning guidelines for the development of any such facilities, and they will apply to them. I'm just conscious of time because we have to finish before there's another joint Oireachtas committee meeting actually at 5 o'clock, so we need to. Deputy Sherlock, if you could try and keep it.
My apologies in the first instance for being late. I was chairing another committee, and I just thank the Minister for appearing before us today. And just to make a very general point, that I hope that we can have a further engagement with the Minister on a kind of a line-by-line basis, if time would allow for that at some future date, because there are the 42 recommendations of our own committee versus the 180 actions of government actions, if you will. And I perceive that there is a gap there in terms of what the All-Party Committee has done in terms of its recommendations and where the government is. So notwithstanding what I would say the very positive aspirations in the government's approach to this, I think that if government, and I mean all of government, can work with the joint committee in respect of ironing out some of the gaps that exist. And one of those gaps, for example, is in relation to the legislative piece around this, and Deputy Pringle touched on it earlier. There is a sense of urgency, arguably on the part of the joint committee, in relation to the need to put in place, sooner rather than later, a legislative base around the legally binding targets leading to 2030 and then onto the net zero piece for 2050. That's one of the recommendations. And I'm a little bit worried that the government's approach to this is that if we don't see a bill until March, that it could be the end of 2020 by the time we see a legislative piece around this, and that another year could conceivably go by the time you're into these binding targets. That's the first worry I have, and which I hope that the Minister could address. And the second one, which is probably the most important one, is in relation to the 60 million tonnes, coming down to an equivalent of 33 million tonnes by 2030. And what I don't see mapped across the government's plan is very clear metrics about how we get from 60 to 33, you know, in keeping with the 2030 targets. And already, you know, and I say this very respectfully, and having worked with Minister Bruton in previous departments and knowing, you know, what he has delivered, you know, in previous iterations and previous departments, the worry I have is that, again, there would be a slippage in relation to overshooting the 2030 targets in favour of, you know, an aspiration to net zero by 2050, but that by 2030 that we're still way off target in relation to our commitments under Paris in 2015. And I'm just wondering if there needs to be a greater sense of urgency about very clear, bespoke actions, and, you know, in relation to, you know, community energy. I'll just pick three: community energy, rural transport, active travel, the rewetting of peatlands. The fear I have now is that what we'll see from government is a siloed approach where individual line departments, that there won't be a proper reporting mechanism, or schmocked, to use that word, won't be put on individual line departments to deliver on those actions, and that if there isn't a proper overarching either cabinet subcommittee or, you know, a robust climate action delivery board, that line departments will slip in terms of what their obligations are in respect of their actions, you know, to deliver on climate action. I mean, again, I don't think it's enough for government, and I say this respectfully, I don't think it's enough for government to come before the committee to say, look, it would be for Minister Madigan to look at, you know, the rewetting issue of peatlands, because we already have evidence through our own deliberations in the committee that, you know, currently only 1% of peatlands in Ireland are under rehabilitation or restoration. What I'd like to hear is where the whole of government approach is to that, rather than having to wait to hear from Minister Madigan on it, you know. So that's my first take.
I'm just conscious of time, Deputy, because there's two more speakers, and I don't think they're going to have a chance to come in.
I do, and I'm very conscious of that as well. And I don't think I've probably taken up as much time.
I know, in fairness, I'm sorry.
And I'm very conscious of that. So, look, the delays in legislation, lack of urgency there being the key point, overshooting the targets in relation to 2030, that's a deep worry. A proper whole-of-government approach, you know, in relation to carbon budgeting and in relation to ensuring that, you know, there are clear, permutations or clear reverberations if individual line departments don't deliver, and the legislative base that would put legally binding targets. Those are the key worries I have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Deputy. I appreciate that. Minister.
Well, I hope I can put some of those concerns to rest. First of all, I see this as an iterative process. So if there are Oireachtas recommendations that need to be developed, we will work with the committee to develop those where they can be shown to be cost effective in a transition. So I think it's really important that we pick the changes in the correct order. I think that's we've taken a lot of care, and the only reason we were able to bring every government department with us to sign up to the targets we've set is that we've shown that they were based on the least burden approach. So we've been able to say to people, if you want to take out your obligation here, let you know that you are opting for a more expensive change to be made in some other sector. So, you know, that approach has been really important to get everyone to come up to the starting line. So, just to say there's another thing you could be doing, you know, I think we have to make sure that it's in the right order. There is no reluctance to bring forward or reticence to bring forward legislation, but, you know, from hard experience, and the Deputy will know it as much as I do, getting stuff through the AG's office, the parliamentary draftsman, through heads, through committees, that's a slow process, and, you know, it will be challenging to meet those. We do have a binding target, so it's not that we don't have a binding target. We have a binding target to 2030, and it has penalties attached to it. We have set in this plan sectoral targets, so ministers will be accountable for achieving sectoral targets. What the legislation will do is, of course, slice them into 5-year blocks and have more forensic entitlement, obligation. But we will already in this have those sectoral targets. You're worried that we're not, making sufficient effort in the period of 2030. Like, what I've done is adopted what you might call a precautionary principle. I've not used the trajectory of high oil prices to pretend that we don't need to make changes. I've assumed that oil prices will stay low, so therefore we're having to plan for more structural change, not less. And I've also not used banked on the 18.8 million flexibility, as it's called, where you can switch from earnings we would get in the ETS sector to offset changes we ought to be making in the non-ETS. So this is a real target, it's a demanding target, and we're setting out, and there is the detail of what changes need to be made to underpin it. And there will be an obligation on the department, as and from, the coming weeks, we will have a delivery board within the Department of Taoiseach overseeing the delivery of the 183 actions. So we're not waiting for a legislative underpinning to put in place that type of accountability.
Okay,
and there will be the estimate. We will be showing, where, if you like, in any year where there is an obligation created on the state because we're not meeting the target, that won't be shown in my department as it now is. It will be shown in the relevant department, so that it will be more closely attached to the sector that fell short.
And just on the carbon budgeting, like, does the Minister envisage that there would be a financial price put on that, or a financial figure put on that, or a figure put on the carbon saving in net tonnage, if you will? Because if we're disseminating information for public discourse on this, what people like us would be watching in opposition is, where's the 60 million reducing down to the 33 million? And that's the key metric here, really, isn't it?
It is, and that's going to be sliced into 5-year slices, and departments will therefore have what their
delivery
number of abatement that they have to get off that tonnage will be in that 5-year period. And where it is identified that we are falling short and there is a cost falling on the exchequer, it won't appear in my budget as I having to purchase credits. It will appear in the respective budget. So at least it will be more visible to people like yourself, looking at the numbers as to where the shortfall happened.
Thank you, Minister. I'm very sorry about this. If we could try and keep it to questions. Deputy Danny Healy-Rae and Deputy Kenny have indicated we have another meeting in this room at 5 o'clock. So if we were supposed to get out 10 minutes before. Sorry, Deputy. Away you go.
Minister, thank you very much, Chairman. This is a very radical plan that has many people, in fact, an awful lot of people in rural Ireland shocked, they're frightened, they're afraid of what the future holds for them. And you see, they wouldn't mind if it was practical and if it was done gradually, but setting targets and setting deadlines without not properly funding people for the changes that he is saying they'll have to make. And you see, I suppose what they're saying to me, what has happened and why all this urgent hullabaloo is happening at the present time is because of what happened. The Greens won a few seats in the local elections and the European elections. And Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are both to be over each other now, to be greener than the Greens. And the people in between are going to be sandwiched and going to suffer. And you see, what they're asking me, like a very honourable, fine gentleman in the village of Brosna the other night at 12 o'clock, he said, Danny, he said, we could listen and accept and try to do our best. But he said, why aren't other larger economies and countries being asked to do the same? Why haven't they the same deadlines and the same targets? Just take Ireland, he said, we point 0.6 of the population of the world. China and India have 40% of the population. And there's no targets or no deadlines at all on them. And you see, I'm asking you, why are we being targeted? Why is our little country, why is our little small country? Because them are the questions I'm being asked. So it's going to hurt farmers and it's going to hurt self-employed people in rural Ireland because they have to travel. And you see, just take houses, and they have been used to heating their houses with turf. They cut their own turf, and because they have to travel long journeys to go to work or to go wherever it is, they have to use cars. They have no other transport, and any other idea that they will have public transport, that will not happen in rural Ireland for rural people. They'll need a car, and you see, and they'll need that tractor. And just take the tractor. I've on my farm at home, I have a 1995 tractor, so that's kind of coming up to 30 years. I'm no different to anyone else, and that's what they have. A tractor is a long-term investment for a farmer. So if he's going to have to get an electric tractor, first of all, I haven't seen any of these electric tractors. I don't know how practical they are. Who's going to subsidise people to buy these? Because farmers are only barely existing as it is at the present time. So they're not going to be allowed cut turf, they're not going to be allowed burn timber, and there's trees falling down all around them. And it's not practical, and if it was practical, people would listen to it. Farmers have invested so much on slatted tanks and environmental matters, and now they're being told that they'll have to reduce production. And I mean, at the same time, go back every day, going back, but we were told they'd have to increase production to stay viable. So, Minister, could you just, will I finish, or will I...
But okay, just, if another question, just to pose the question, if you do have another question for him.
Yeah, just, look, it's kind of all related, and to delay the thing, if I, So, just a few things there. Look, slurry spreading, low emission spreading equipment. Why don't you remove the VAT from that? Forestry, he said, would eat up carbon. And at the same time, there's so much marginal land in South Kerry and in every part of Kerry. It's so marginal, but he won't give them a grant to plant on the marginal ground. He'll give them a grant for planting good ground, all right, green ground as they call it, but he will not give them a grant for to plant marginal ground. And then there's a problem where if the storm, which has happened, knocks all the forestry, there's no grant for to replant it. So if he were serious about planting trees, he could help people in that regard. There's people that can't cut their forestry, they get the last grant after 15 years of production, Minister, of 15 years of planting it, and they can't cut it until 30 years. It's not viable to cut it. So it is there, it is doing the country good. But like the farmer that came in to me the other day, he says, well, I'm getting nothing for it. And then you have the other type of a farmer. At some time in February, there was 140 farmers that couldn't take out their timber and replant it again because the roads that they applied for wouldn't be allowed to get planning permission by serial objectors. And, I mean, I've asked this question in the Dáil, what's going to be done about these serial objectors? These are real issues, and there's designations then, hin harrier designations. A farmer can't plant a forestry on a land that's designated for hin harrier. But at the same time, right on the other side of the ditch, there's a forestry that was planted with 25 years, 20 years, and that's growing there fine. And the hin harrier has no problem going into where the forest is. So there's ridiculous things. And then just another thing,
finally,
Chair. Yeah. Are you aware, Minister, at this present time, as I'm looking at you here inside, we are prevented from buying certain types of machinery now, let it be tractors, lorries, and at the same time, if it's not complying with certain emission rules and regulations. But I know that, in fact, track machines are being produced, brand new, the old style, the old type engines, brand new machines, and being sold down to India, China, Africa. And I mean, we're all under the same sky, Minister. I mean, and we have to be realistic. So, I mean, what you're saying here and with the last week is going to have a serious devastating effect on jobs. It will close down, farmers' gates will be closed.
I'm going to bring the Minister in that. I think your point is well made.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's a mistake to pretend that there is an obligation to buy an electric tractor, or there is an obligation to stop burning turf, or there is an obligation to cut herd size. There is no such obligation in this plan, and I think that should, those who are shocked or frightened should be reassured by that. But I think equally we have to recognise that we are starting on a journey of change where Ireland and the people you represent are extremely exposed. Many of our enterprises and our farms and our towns and our villages and our homes are at risk in a world that is changing so rapidly. And you only have to listen to young people coming home and saying that our generation is failing them to understand that this is real. It's real in Kerry just as it's real in any other area. So if farmers want a future and want strong family farm income in the future, they have to start thinking as well about the changes that need to be made to copper fasten the future of family farm income. And the sort of changes that they are being asked to make are absolutely sensible changes. Many of them pay for themselves over their lifetime. There will be a common agricultural policy coming up, and 40% of the income support that is going to come to farmers under that will be attached to them, showing demonstrably that they're making changes that will improve the environment and reduce carbon impact. So, there will be recognition of the farmers who are making the pioneering change, but there will also, by making that pioneering change, those farmers will be putting their farm in a better place to be thriving in the future. Because increasingly, I've been on trade missions, people who are buying our product are asking, what's the environmental certification of what we're doing? Show me the evidence of the sustainable methods that you're using. That's what's being asked. And if we want to get premium margins on our agricultural produce because of their quality and their origin green, we have to make these changes. So these are things that are in the interests of our community, whether they be rural or urban. And in many ways, they're more in the interests of rural communities because of the 90% exporting feature of a lot of the produce of rural Ireland. They're dependent on these international markets. When it comes to the issue of, what about China and India? China and India are part of the UN agreement. They are making the changes, but they're starting from a position of way, way lower impact on global carbon emissions and greenhouse gases than we are. They're way, way below us. So us saying that we're not willing to make the change because people in poor countries who are at a much lower stage of development and who haven't been part of the fossil boom should be making more changes than we are, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If we went to Europe and tried to advocate, or to the UN and tried to advocate that we in Ireland, who is one of the wealthy countries, are going to sit on our hands waiting for China and India to make the changes, people would rightly say that was a contemptible position to be taking up. We have to be part of a change that has to happen globally, and there's no easy way around this. If we want to pass on our environment in a better state to our children and the next generations, we have to start making these changes and start making them now. And the window of opportunity to do that is very narrow. There is a tipping point coming when the environmental damage that will be done by carbon emissions is going to accelerate, not decelerate, and these changes are upon us. I think it's entirely wrong for your friend to suggest to you that this is part of an election result. I mean, this committee and the climate action, the climate advisory, the climate, what do you call them? The council,
Climate Change Advisory Council.
The Citizens' Assembly, they've been working for months and months in detailed hearings. This was nothing got to do with an election result. But the election result perhaps does reflect on the importance that this issue has for our world and our country. And that's, so it's timely that we are showing as a political grouping here of all parties that we're facing up to this, and we unanimously adopted, including yourself, unanimously adopted this plan that was produced by the committee. There wasn't a single dissenting voice in declaring a climate emergency and adopting the plan that we are is a big part of the influence of what we are doing as a government. So, I think these are the right things to do, and we will try to ease the passage for people, be they farmers or householders. There will be supports from the state, but we can't pay for everything, and we're going to have to try and design policies that help people to make these changes. At times we'd have to say, look, it's time to stop doing X. It's time to stop putting oil boilers into new houses. That's the sort of change, but that's sensible. Why would we commit lockdown houses into a fossil system that will become more and more expensive for that household to run? So we're asking people to do sensible things that are part of a pathway that will help our communities to be resilient in the future in a very rapidly changing environment.
Deputy Kenny, I have to bring in Deputy Kenny.
Just one question. I need clarity in one thing.
Really quickly.
Are you saying, Minister, that people who burn turf or burn timber will not be penalised in the future?
I'm not saying.
Are you saying that?
I didn't say that. I said there was no obligation to stop burning turf, but of course, carbon.
You want to penalise them, though?
Just let the Minister finish.
Because it's not penalising them. People who are burning coal, or burning turf, or burning oil, are creating an environmental damage that everyone in the globe is having to pay for. So by saying there's going to be a price put on the damage that is done, you're following a very long established principle that, if I'm doing damage, you'd understand this if if the carbon that was being emitted was a huge plume of smoke and was going out and you could see it, and I said to you, you're going to have to stop that. If you're going to continue that, you're going to have to pay. But because carbon is not visible in that way, you don't see the damage. It's harder for people to say, I'm doing this damage because they don't see it in that visible way. But it's happening.
So and you're going to penalise turf and timber burners.
Okay,
and you're saying one other thing, and I'm not going out here without contradicting on it. You said this country was wealthy. Yes, Dublin is wealthy, but rural Ireland is not wealthy.
Deputy I have to bring in Deputy Kenny. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's only a few minutes left.
Yeah.
I'll give you good time.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the Minister for his comments. I've learned a little bit here. I want to focus just on agriculture mainly and on, if you like, the custodians of the land and the opportunity that may be there for them in the future. Forestry has been mentioned as being one of the big methods of sequestering carbon. Now, in Leitrim we have a huge amount of forestry. We feel that we have over our fair share at this stage, where we're reaching probably 30% of the land is covered in, mainly silky spruce and the whole monoculture and all that. But I'm not going to get into that with you, Minister. What I want to talk about is some of the issues that could make a big difference now and that aren't making a difference. For instance, every farmer in rural Ireland gets, through Common Agricultural Policy Pillar 1, they get the Pillar 1 payments, right? Now, when they do that, there's a map which shows their land parcel, and each land parcel is divided by the hedgerow, right? Now, what happens is they put in their land parcels and they have so many hectares for their payments. Then, a photograph is taken from outer space, and if the hedgerow happens to be growing out a little bit wider, and they lose, we'll say, 1/2 metre along the length of the hedgerow, they're penalised, and they could lose up to 20% of their payment, which is probably 20% of their income, because in some cases it's more than 100% of their own farm income, the payment they get from Europe. And a change in that, and it's just a simple change, to say that the hedgerow, to say that a clump of whins in the side of the field can also be included as part of the land parcel, rather than immediately punishing farmers for it, would mean, because everywhere I go around the country, and you see it everywhere, where hedgerows are cut to the stump, it's not because the farmers want to do that, it's because they're being penalised by the Department of Agriculture for not allowing them to grow. Another issue I want to raise as well is in regard to new sectors, has been mentioned, and you know that we need to develop new sectors in agriculture, and plastics is one of those issues where you have plant cellulose which could be used to make plastics which would be biodegradable. Now that won't happen by farmers doing it on their own. To develop a sector which would be large enough for it to be sustainable into the future, they need to be partnered with either big business or government to make that happen. So Minister, what I'm asking you is, are you going to just leave it to the market to find that solution, or is government prepared to play a role in making sure that sectors like that, hemp is the obvious one, which is a sector there which could provide an income for farmers and provide a solution for much of our biodegradable plastics problem, and also provide a solution in regard to carbon sequestration. Other issues such as the solar panels on the roofs of farm sheds is another thing which I know is in the proposals, but are you talking about paying for that electricity, and at what level will it be paid for? I leave it at that because I understand it's a very short time.
Do you have a brief question? Because we only have a minute or two.
I appreciate you letting me in because I'm not on the committee, but my colleagues had to go away. Just very quickly, Minister, and again, I'm going to keep it very brief. Do you think it's realistic to say that we can be carbon neutral by 2050, in your own opinion? The other point in relation to, by the way, I accept we as a nation have got to do something. But do you accept that there's a need for major investment in the rural transport system? You know, like the local link being expanded rapidly, because unfortunately a lot of people in the rural areas have to rely on their cars. And I'm glad that you clarified there the issue in relation to that people won't be forced out of their cars and won't be forced to certain things. Thirdly, it has been reported that the NTA purchased 200 diesel buses last year. Is that going ahead? Are they going to be used despite the fact that we're trying to change the attitude to climate and we'd have these 30 diesel buses around? Can you clarify that? Fourthly, job opportunities in the Midlands, you know, the demise of the ESB, Bord na Móna, different methods of farming is going to change things. So there is going to be a serious challenge there in relation to jobs and jobs creation. Are we going to focus on that at some stage? And I had one other question, but if we leave it for now.
Only about a minute, less than a minute.
Okay, be very quick. I'll have to say that I can see the point you're making about perverse hedge cutting created. I'll have to pass that on to people who are better. There certainly are going to be new sectors. The issue, like Enterprise Ireland, is tried and tested in helping startups. You know, they have their high potential startups. They have their, their commercialisation of technologies that are emerging from our colleges. We have one of the best support structures for emerging technologies of any country, bar none. We added to that have the Disruptive Fund and the Climate Action Fund. There are ample opportunities if there's emerging technologies to commercialise them. I don't think the state will be taking on that. I think it will be
with
through
scale, Minister.
Well, I think it has to grow to scale. Like Enterprise Ireland companies have grown to scale. They start with high potential startup. The Enterprise Ireland has been able to attract. They put in their own capital. They attract venture capital. You know, there is a very good model for developing technologies, and you know, I've been responsible for it. I don't see anyone better in any of the countries that I go to, and where you get state deciding to do it, you create a rigidity that is hard to replicate. Bord na Móna is an exception because of its long history, but Bord na Móna is looking for technologies to adopt, and we have there a state company that is diversifying and is looking for new technologies. So, you know, I think we have I don't think we should start saying the state is going to go into any new wheeze that we've identified. Let it emerge in the usual way. The prices of electricity to microgenerators are to community res in an auction. They will have to be decided over time. They're not set at this point. They have to be evolved. I think it is a challenge to be carbon neutral by 2050, but I think if we start to make the changes and we start to evolve the technologies, it is possible. And there is a very strong, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, who aren't the most radical in this area, are saying that the price of a tonne of carbon in 2050 will be $265 a tonne. If you factor that into some of the things we're doing today, you could see what a radical change that would represent for a lot of things. So, things are going to change pretty rapidly, and we have to try and be ahead of that. I accept rural transport is an issue. It is recognised in the report, but I don't think we can ever, as Senator Michelle Mulherin said, we're not going to have trains going up every boreen. So we have to come up with innovative solutions, whether it be shared services, whether it be pooling, whether there's ways, innovative ways of doing it. And I think we need to collectively explore those. The 200 diesel buses, they were purchased. It's from the 1st of July, there is no diesel. But let me assure you that these are low-emission diesel buses, and they're replacing ones that are far, far worse. They were bought on a previous, procurement framework. A new procurement framework is now coming into place. There will be no more diesel buses. That's coming into place from the 1st of July, and that's the policy from here on in. And I think, the job opportunity in the regions is going to continue to be a huge challenge, and that's why I'm a big advocate for a national broadband plan. I don't want to ask you or you, but I think we need to do things like that. We need to have regional enterprise strategies. We need to have hubs that are looking at emerging technologies like what Martin Kenny was saying, and we need to try to develop those using our resources. So I accept that we can do better in that area, but we've some of the infrastructure there to build off.
Thank you very much, and thank you, members. Thank you, Minister, and your officials for coming before us this afternoon. So the Joint Committee is adjourned until Wednesday, the 26th of June 2019. Thank you very much.